You're told this was a holy tragedy, a divine necessity, a moment wrapped in mystery and stained by betrayal. But what if the truth was sharper than the stories that softened it? What if the death of Jesus wasn't merely a spiritual turning point, but a calculated political execution engineered by men who feared his influence more than his teachings? Imagine Jerusalem simmering with tension, a city ready to ignite. Imagine officials watching one man draw crowds large enough to tilt the balance of power. And imagine that everything, every accusation, every hurried hearing, every whispered meeting in torchlit halls wasn't about theology at all, but about neutralizing a threat. So you breathe in slowly, allowing the heat of that idea to settle. The pace eases, the urgency softens, and you feel the ground beneath the story widen just a little, inviting you deeper into the shadows, where politics and faith entwine like uneasy partners. You move through this ancient city in your mind, stepping past stone walls warmed by late spring nights, hearing distant voices weaving through narrow streets. The air is thick with the kind of anticipation people don't talk about until years later when they finally admit they felt something shifting under their feet. You sense the pull of competing powers here, Rome's heavy hand temple authorities, guarding their fragile autonomy, wandering preachers stirring hearts that are already hungry for change. In that blend of hope and fear, you begin to understand why one man could become the focal point of so many anxieties. It isn't just what he said, it's how people reacted. It isn't just what he stood for, it's where those ideals pointed. And as you ease into the long story ahead, you'll feel how each detail forms a quiet piece of a larger pattern, a pattern that hints at intention, strategy, calculation. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Let your breath settle. Let your mind drift open and follow the trail that begins in a crowded city and leads toward a cross that might have been less about heaven and more about politics. You step into Jerusalem at the turn of the 1st century, letting the noise settle around you like dust that never quite leaves the air. The city feels crowded, even before you picture the pilgrims swelling its narrow streets, and somewhere in that pressure, you sense the same unease you noticed earlier when imagining officials watching one man draw too much attention. That earlier spark of tension now stretches into a full landscape rising out of stone and politics and human fear. The city stands under Roman rule, yet it beats with Jewish identity, layered with long-held hopes that one day the land will be free again. That's your first solid fact of the investigation. Judea is a province simmering with resentment maintained not by trust, but by force. Rome knows this. Local rulers know it. And everyone, whether elite or ordinary, feels the weight of a fragile balance that could shatter with the wrong word spoken at the wrong moment. The city is built in levels, spiritual, political, emotional, and you begin to move through them with a kind of quiet awareness. To your left rises the temple complex, the symbolic heart of Jewish life, a place where authority is concentrated, not only in priests, but in an entire administrative network, managing sacrifices, finances, purity laws, and social order. People often imagine Jerusalem as purely sacred geography, but the temple is also a bureaucratic machine, a center of economic activity, and a physical reminder of what a conquered people can still call their own. That dual nature is one of the obscure details scholars sometimes mention, but rarely linger on. The temple wasn't only a spiritual institution, it was a power hub, and that meant anyone who challenged its rhythms threatened more than belief, they threatened stability and revenue. You feel that tension as you walk along the pavements worn smooth by generations. Soldiers stand posted at strategic corners, not in overwhelming numbers, but enough to remind you who actually governs this land. Their presence isn't constant oppression. It's strategic pressure, a quiet message that Rome will tolerate culture, ritual, and debate as long as silence reigns where it matters most. Every festival season is a test of that arrangement. Passover especially pulls tens of thousands of pilgrims into the city, all remembering liberation from a foreign power while currently living under another. You can see why Pilate, the Roman prefect, makes a point of being in Jerusalem during these celebrations, rather than staying comfortably in Caesarea by the sea. His presence signals vigilance, his soldiers signal readiness, and the city senses both like the low hum of a storm that might break or might pass unnoticed. As you drift through the crowd, you hear layered conversations about prophets, taxes, harvests, purity, healing, and politics disguised as prayer. It's impossible to separate faith from resistance here. The categories bleed into each other. That mixture is what makes the place volatile, and it's also what shapes the open question still debated today: were messianic hopes in this era primarily spiritual, or were they fundamentally political dreams coded in religious language? Scholars argue both sides, and the truth may be that the people living here didn't draw the clean distinctions modern readers prefer. For them, a savior was someone who could restore order, identity, and dignity, whether through divine intervention or social upheaval. The closer you move toward the temple courts, the more layered the city's power structure appears. Priests guard ritual purity, while also negotiating with Roman officials trying to preserve autonomy without provoking military intervention. The high priest holds office at Rome's pleasure, replaced whenever his loyalty appears to waver. That awkward arrangement generates quiet compromises few want to admit publicly. It's not difficult to imagine why leaders might view any charismatic preacher with caution, especially one capable of drawing large crowds. You recall the image from earlier, the one man gathering followers in numbers large enough to unsettle watchful authorities, and you realize how quickly suspicion could build in a place so charged with political risk. Walking through the bustling markets, you notice something else. Often overlooked, many residents live day to day under financial strain. Heavy taxation, temple dues, and local economic pressures create a climate where the promise of change, any change, carries emotional weight. That background explains why crowds are easily stirred, why rumors spread, and why certain teachings resonate more than others. In a world where hope and frustration coexist so closely, a compelling voice can become a lightning rod for anxieties that have lingered for generations. Yet your attention also drifts to the quieter corners of the city, where scholars meet to debate the law, and where political maneuvering unfolds behind shutters and stone walls. These private conversations shape public consequences. Here, alliances form not only through shared belief, but through shared necessity. If someone disrupts the balance that keeps Jerusalem tenuously stable, leaders must act quickly, whether out of fear, calculation, or a desire to avoid Rome's intervention. That hidden urgency will matter later when decisions begin to move faster than explanations. You notice how the city changes at dusk. Lanterns glow along the colonnades and conversations soften into an evening rhythm. But beneath the gentle surface, you feel the crowded pressure that never quite disappears. Even at its calmest, Jerusalem carries the sensation of a lid held down tightly on boiling water. A single disruption could turn spiritual devotion into political crisis. And into this environment walks a teacher from Galilee, praised by some, questioned by others, but followed by enough people that both Rome and the temple authorities must take notice. Somewhere in this mix, the hope, the tension, the overlapping jurisdictions, lies the environment that made one man's fate more than a matter of theology. The question lingering beneath the city's shifting lights is whether his execution emerged from genuine danger or from fear projected by those desperate to maintain control. As you breathe in the warm evening air, you sense that understanding this urban landscape is the first quiet step toward untangling that larger mystery. You drift forward in the story, letting the atmosphere of the city fade into the parchment and ink of those who tried to record what happened here. After walking through crowded markets and shadowed courtyards, you now find yourself holding something far more fragile than stone, the written traces left behind. They are uneven, sometimes contradictory, often maddening in what they reveal and what they refuse to say. Yet they are all you have if you want to trace motives through centuries of storytelling. The first secure fact you rest your hands upon is simple but invaluable. Within a few decades of the crucifixion, written accounts describing Jesus' arrest, trial, and execution were already circulating among early communities. Their existence alone tells you that the event left an imprint deep enough to demand explanation. People remembered, retold, reshaped, and in doing so they left clues. You feel the weight of the Gospels first. They're not courtroom transcripts. They never claim to be. They are narrative testimonies shaped by communities living under Roman rule, communities with theological missions and political anxieties of their own. Their authors wrote with purpose, smoothing certain edges while sharpening others, crafting stories that offered meaning more than strict chronology. This is where silence becomes its own kind of presence. Some details appear in vivid color, while others vanish altogether as if whole hours of the night passed, without witnesses willing to describe them. You wonder whether the gaps are accidents or intentions. Maybe both. The earlier portrait of Jerusalem as a place where public tension ran beneath private negotiation helps you feel these absences more keenly. Where power fears instability, silence can be just as strategic as speech. A less frequently mentioned detail emerges when you lean into the pages of one particular historian, Josephus. His accounts of Judea under Roman rule offer context rather than comfort. He mentions Jesus briefly, sparingly, in wording that scholars debate almost line by line. Some phrases feel too polished, as though they've been smoothed by later editors hoping to strengthen a theological claim. Other lines sound authentically political, the voice of a man well acquainted with rebellion, Roman reprisal, and the fragility of local leadership. The obscure point that lingers is that Josephus, despite his extensive documentation of unrest in Judea, doesn't describe the trial in depth. His brevity itself becomes a question. Did he consider the event too minor within the larger framework of political upheaval? Or did he inherit a version of the story already altered by decades of retelling? As you sit with these sources, you feel them shifting slightly, like stepping stones across a fast-moving stream. They hold your weight, but not without wobble. The Gospels show a pattern of portraying Roman authority with a certain restraint, sometimes even reluctance, which becomes striking when you recall the watchful tension of the city described earlier. Meanwhile, temple leaders appear less divided in these texts than they likely were in reality. High priests operated within a political ecosystem, balancing loyalty, fear, and negotiation with Rome. Yet the stories often compress this intricate landscape into a unified front. You sense the shaping hand of narrative necessity. Stories often need clear actors, simple motives, and lines that connect. Life rarely cooperates. Another detail arises from Roman administrative texts, even though they do not mention Jesus specifically. These documents reveal a consistent pattern. Rome reserved crucifixion for crimes against the state. Banditry, sedition, insurrection, those were the charges that earned wooden beams and public warnings. That historical pattern casts a long shadow over the question driving this investigation. If crucifixion was used primarily to punish political offenders, what does that imply about how Jesus was classified by the authorities? It doesn't answer the question outright, but it shakes the assumption that the trial was purely theological. The punishment chosen often reflects the crime perceived, not the crime claimed, and yet you encounter an open debate that modern scholars still wrestle with. To what extent did the Gospel writers reshape the narrative to ease tensions with Roman authorities? It would not have been unreasonable for early communities living under imperial control to soften Rome's role in the death of their central figure. Emphasizing internal Jewish disputes would have been far safer than accusing the empire of executing an innocent teacher. This debate intertwines with the earlier image of the temple as both spiritual center and bureaucratic institution. If the temple could be both holy and politically strategic, then why couldn't the earliest retellings of the trial be both devotional and diplomatically cautious? You notice yourself reading not only what the sources say, but what they avoid discussing. The hurried nighttime proceedings, the lack of detailed documentation, the absence of Roman records naming the charges, all these silences hint at either limited access or deliberate omission. Silence is not evidence, but it is not neutral either. It invites you to imagine whispered conversations, private anxieties, and unseen pressures shaping actions that later generations would know only through filtered accounts. The more you examine these texts, the more you recognize their layered nature. They are not objective windows into history. They are stained glass, beautiful, meaningful, but crafted. Light passes through them, yes, but colored by the priorities of the communities that shaped them. You think back to the moment in Jerusalem where crowds murmured about profits, taxes, and hope disguised as prayer. Those murmurs never made it into the written accounts with clarity, yet they shaped the environment in which the trial unfolded. Maybe that's why the sources feel as though they lean away from crowds, presenting them sometimes as manipulable masses rather than as human beings responding to political pressure. As you rest your attention on these fragments. Gospel narratives. Josephus's sparse mentions Roman legal customs. You realize how the investigation must move forward. Not by choosing one source and discarding others, but by reading them together, noticing their convergences, their divergences, and the shadows between lines. You begin to sense how every written account is also a negotiation with its own present moment. People write with the world behind them and the world around them shaping every word. In this intricate landscape of storytelling, you feel the next step of the investigation forming. Before you trace motivations, you must understand the man whose presence set these gears turning. But for now, you rest with the uneasy mixture of fact silence and fragile testimony, knowing these imperfect traces are the only doorway into events that continue to shape the world 2 millennia later. You let the parchment fade and return to the warm, dust-filled air of the ancient city, sensing how the written accounts you just examined begin to connect with the man at the center of them. It becomes clear that if you want to understand why officials reacted with such urgency, you must consider not only who Jesus claimed to be, but how he moved through the world. You begin with a foundational historical fact. Jesus was known as a teacher and wonder worker, whose reputation spread across Galilee and Judea, drawing crowds large enough to attract the attention of authorities. Even the most cautious scholars agree that his public presence, whatever its purpose, was significant enough to disrupt local rhythms. Crowds are never just crowds in a politically tense landscape. They are potential movements capable of steering the atmosphere of a city already humming with expectation. As you picture him walking along dusty roads, speaking in parables that carried sharp moral edges, you begin to sense why some listeners might have heard more than spiritual lessons. His emphasis on a coming kingdom, spoken with the kind of intentional ambiguity that leaves both hope and fear suspended in the air could be interpreted in multiple directions. When people are hungry for change, such language becomes dangerous simply because it refuses to stay neutral. The obscurity of that message, the way it hovered between spiritual renewal and political reimagining forms, one of those details often glimpsed but rarely lingered upon. Was the ambiguity purposeful, a way to speak truth without triggering immediate suppression? Or was it simply the natural phrasing of a man whose vision did not separate the divine from the social world? You remember the unsettled atmosphere of Jerusalem described earlier, where tensions ran beneath every stone. In such a place, even a healer could be seen as a potential agitator, especially if his actions carried symbolic weight. Consider the moments when he interacted with people living at the margins, tax collectors, the poor, the sick. Those encounters challenged established hierarchies. To the temple authorities, these gestures might have suggested a reconfiguration of spiritual authority. To Roman officials, they might have hinted at a movement drawing strength from the discontented. And to the ordinary people watching, they might have sparked a sense of possibility that extended beyond ritual purity into the realm of transformed society. You trace his path into villages and synagogues, noticing how his following grew not through force, but through persuasion and presence. Yet even persuasion becomes a political act when the audience is large enough and the message resonates deeply enough. You sense why some leaders felt uneasy. A charismatic figure with a growing crowd is like a moving fault line. It may remain harmless, or it may shift the entire landscape without warning. This is where an open scholarly debate emerges. Did Jesus intentionally challenge political structures? Or did his message simply carry unavoidable political implications in a land where religion and governance were entwined? The debate continues precisely because the evidence points in multiple directions, and each interpretation reshapes the meaning of his trial. Your thoughts drift to the ways he navigated power. When questioned about taxes, he offered a response that felt both clever and unsettling. "Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar," he said, "and to God what belongs to God." On the surface, a balanced remark. Beneath the surface, a subtle question: what truly belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God? In a land where divine authority underpinned identity, this was no small question. It walked the thin line between compliance and critique. You begin to appreciate how a single sentence could send ripples through both temple corridors and Roman administrative halls. You also recall how he addressed the temple itself, hinting at its vulnerability, suggesting that God's presence was not confined to stone and ritual. These statements would not have felt abstract to those who depended on the temple's authority for maintaining social and religious order. Even the suggestion of a world in which the temple's role shifted would have carried profound implications. It is here that a less obvious detail emerges. The temple economy was intertwined with political stability. Disrupt the flow of ritual commerce and symbolic authority, and you risk destabilizing the delicate balance between local leadership and Roman oversight. Words alone, if compelling enough, could be interpreted as threats. As your mind returns to earlier impressions of Jerusalem, soldiers at street corners, priests negotiating influence, crowds moving with restless anticipation, you see how each aspect forms part of the canvas against which Jesus' actions were judged. You picture him stepping into that environment with confidence that feels calm rather than confrontational, and yet the calm itself becomes unsettling. Confident teachers attract followers. Followers attract scrutiny. Scrutiny attracts intervention. You linger on another scholarly question, one debated with as much interest as the earlier issue of source reliability. Did Jesus anticipate that his message would lead to conflict with authorities? Or did he expect spiritual transformation to unfold without political consequence? Interpretations divide sharply here. Some argue he foresaw the danger and embraced it as part of his mission. Others believe he intended reform rather than confrontation, and the political implications rose simply from the environment itself. Both views draw from the same fragments of narrative, yet they paint different portraits of the man. And yet beneath all these debates, you feel a unifying thread regardless of his intentions. His presence stirred reactions grounded in fear of social instability. That fear becomes more tangible when you recall the earlier description of festival crowds swelling the city, multiplying anxieties with every additional person. A movement forming around a charismatic teacher during such a moment could not be ignored by those tasked with maintaining order. Whether he sought political confrontation or simply embodied a message that could not avoid political resonance, the outcome was the same. He became someone officials needed to watch. As you step back from these impressions, you notice how they begin to circulate around a central realization. Jesus, the spiritual teacher, and Jesus, the perceived political actor, cannot be separated, not because he intended both roles, but because the world around him could not distinguish them. In a land where governance, faith, identity, and hope intertwined, every public act carried layers of meaning. And once those layers accumulated in the eyes of authority, the path toward the events that followed became easier to imagine. You breathe gently, allowing this portrait to settle. Ahead lies the moment when imagery and crowds amplify the tension even further. But for now, you linger with the feeling that a man walking peacefully through Galilee could become almost inevitably a figure entangled in the politics of an empire. You move with the swelling crowd, now letting the dust rise around your sandals, and the heat of anticipation cling to your skin the way it must have clung to everyone gathering along the road into Jerusalem. The memory of the previous chapter lingers quietly in the background, especially the realization that a charismatic teacher walking through tense streets could unsettle authorities without uttering a single explicitly political demand. Here, the stakes become even clearer. The moment Jesus enters Jerusalem is one of the few events described with remarkable consistency across the sources, giving you another piece of solid historical footing, a public celebrated entry during a major festival. The scene is described vividly, people spreading garments, waving branches, shouting phrases laced with expectation. Even if embellishment grew over time, the core fact remains intact. His arrival drew attention on a scale impossible for power to ignore. That attention is not neutral. In a place as tightly monitored as Jerusalem during Passover, a crowd cheering any figure suggests possibility, and possibility in a restless province can feel like a crack in the dam. You picture how the Romans stationed above the city would view this moment. Soldiers watching from battlements didn't need theological expertise to sense the danger. They only needed to see bodies gathering and voices rising. To them, the triumphal entry might have looked less like religious devotion and more like a rally. Even the choice to ride a donkey, often interpreted symbolically as an echo of prophetic kingship, would have registered differently when seen from the vantage point of imperial caution. Symbolic gestures can be misread, or perhaps too accurately read, in environments saturated with political tension. There's an obscure detail embedded in this scene that scholars sometimes mention, but rarely unpack: palm branches, a symbol layered with historical connotations. For locals, palms represented victory and deliverance imagery, connected not only to ancient psalms, but also to more recent memories of resistance movements. The Hasmonean rebels, celebrated for fighting foreign domination generations earlier, were associated with similar gestures. Whether or not every person in that crowd intended a political message, leaders observing from a distance would have recognized the iconography. It is one thing to celebrate a teacher, It is another to surround him with symbols of liberation in a city filled with Roman soldiers. Even subtle gestures can carry the weight of historical memory. Your thoughts drift back to earlier descriptions of Jerusalem as a place where devotion and discontent blend seamlessly. In such a world, crowds carry emotional voltage. They pulse with collective longing, frustration, and hope, forming a force that can shift direction quickly and unpredictably. That volatility forms the backdrop to a long-standing scholarly debate. Were the people celebrating simply expressing spiritual enthusiasm, or were they participating in a public demonstration with political undertones too subtle to name aloud? Arguments continue because the sources leave room for both interpretations and because ancient crowds rarely separate the sacred from the political. Whether intentionally or not, the imagery surrounding him evoked themes that made authorities uneasy. As you watch the scene unfold in your mind, the connection to earlier impressions grows stronger. You remember how his teachings moved through Galilee, gathering followers who responded not only to spiritual guidance, but to the possibility of transformation. That same dynamic appears here, amplified by the scale of the city and the heightened emotions of the festival. The mixture of noise, movement, and symbolic gestures creates a tableau that leaders could interpret as a signal, a moment when a new figure might be testing how far the people were willing to go. Even if Jesus had no intention of sparking rebellion, perception mattered more than intention. Power reacts not to what a person means, but to what a crowd might do in response to them. You notice how the geography of the city shapes the event's impact. Approaching from the Mount of Olives, he would have descended along a path overlooking the temple complex. That vantage carries its own symbolic resonance. Prophetic tradition linked the location to visions of renewal and divine visitation. To anyone watching, the image of a teacher descending toward the temple with a crowd cheering behind him might evoke hopes or fears of imminent change. Here, the emotional texture thickens, blending joy, tension, and apprehension. You feel how quickly the mood could shift, how triumph could transform into alarm, depending on who interpreted the moment. Another small but telling detail emerges when you focus on the behavior of the crowd. Their shouts are described with phrases that can be translated as calls for salvation or deliverance. These words, while spiritual in tone, would not have sounded purely religious to ears trained on political danger. In contexts of occupation, language of deliverance tends to carry double meanings. This dual resonance deepens the unease that temple officials and Roman administrators likely felt. Religious enthusiasm might be tolerated, even indulged, as long as it remained tidy. Mass excitement tinged with hopes of deliverance could not be. The buildup of symbolic tension leads naturally into a question that scholars continue to examine: did Jesus intend this moment to communicate a message of kingship, humility, divine renewal, or something else entirely? Interpretations vary. Some argue he deliberately enacted prophetic imagery to make a theological claim about peace rather than revolt. Others suggest that regardless of intention, the combination of timing, location, and crowd behavior created a scenario that no authority could view as harmless. The beauty of ambiguity becomes the danger of ambiguity. When meaning is open, people fill it with what they fear or desire most. Your mind wanders again through the crowd, noticing the different types of people gathered: pilgrims, locals, children, elders, supporters, skeptics, traders, pausing their work to watch. Every face carries its own interpretation, and interpretation becomes its own kind of participation. The authorities observing from a distance would not care about nuance. They would care about momentum, and momentum was unmistakable here. A crowd moving with enthusiasm is easier to start than to stop. Once it swells, leaders must guess at its potential without the luxury of certainty. You recall the earlier image of Jerusalem at festival time, already saturated with tension. Into that atmosphere stepped a figure whose arrival triggered symbolic gestures and public celebration. Whether or not he sought political confrontation, the optics created uncertainty, and uncertainty is the birthplace of preemptive action. Leaders did not need proof of rebellion. They only needed the suggestion of possibility. Perception becomes motive. Motive becomes justification. As you let the scene quiet the crowds dispersing into narrow streets, you feel how this moment deepens the path toward conflict. Symbols have spoken even if words remain ambiguous. The city has taken notice, and those responsible for maintaining order now have a reason, perhaps small, perhaps exaggerated, to discuss intervention before the momentum grows beyond control. You follow the crowd's energy as it fades into quieter streets, letting the echoes of palm branches and shouts settle into something more intricate. What lingered in the air after that procession was not simply excitement, but expectation shaped by language older than empires, woven through prophecies and hopes that generations carried like quiet embers. To understand why authorities reacted the way they did, you now look more closely at the words attributed to Jesus, and just as importantly, the words spoken about him. Here lies another foundational historical fact. In the decades surrounding his life, messianic expectation was not an abstract idea, but a living, breathing hope among many Jewish communities. People longed for deliverance from foreign rule, for restoration, for renewal. Into that landscape stepped a man whose followers increasingly described him using phrases linked to that expectation, even if he never claimed the titles in straightforward terms. You remember how the triumphal entry swelled with symbols that could be interpreted as royal imagery. Those gestures didn't exist in a vacuum. They connected to a vocabulary already thick with meaning. When people used words like anointed deliverer or son of David, they invoked not only spiritual lineage, but political memory. These terms had once described kings who defended the land leaders, who defied oppression. Even if Jesus intended those words in a spiritual sense, the people hearing them might not have separated the layers. Language carries history. History carries weight. And weight, when misinterpreted or amplified, can shift the trajectory of events. A more obscure detail surfaces when you glance toward the Dead Sea region, where fragments of ancient scrolls preserve writings from a community deeply invested in messianic prophecy. Their texts reference multiple types of messiahs, priestly, royal, prophetic, and explore how each might transform the world. This diversity reminds you that messianic language wasn't uniform. It meant different things to different groups. Some imagined a warrior liberator, others a teacher of righteousness. The ambiguity in these ancient writings helps illuminate the ambiguity that surrounded Jesus. His message could intersect with multiple interpretations, each carrying different implications. Leaders trying to maintain stability would have worried not only about what he meant, but about what listeners might believe he meant. You then consider particular moments in the stories preserved about him. When he spoke of a kingdom arriving not through revolt, but through transformation, those words hovered between literal and metaphorical. They could be read as purely spiritual renewal, but in a land governed by a foreign empire, any talk of a kingdom risked being interpreted politically. You recall how earlier narratives described the crowd shouting phrases of deliverance during his arrival. Their excitement likely infused his words with intensity he never anticipated. Even the gentlest metaphor can become a banner when lifted by the hopes of a restless people. An open, scholarly debate unfolds in your thoughts. Did he consciously use ambiguous language to reframe messianic expectation into something nonviolent and spiritual, or did he speak with clarity that later generations misunderstood? Some argue he intentionally avoided direct claims to prevent misinterpretation. Others suggest he spoke plainly, and the ambiguity arose only after stories circulated across cultures and languages. The uncertainty persists because the sources shaped by theological motives and historical pressures leave just enough silence for multiple interpretations to feel plausible. As you examine these possibilities, the earlier image of the temple reappears, its dual nature as spiritual sanctuary and administrative center. Leaders there would have been especially sensitive to any language suggesting a shift in authority. Even a hint that someone might embody prophetic figures long associated with national renewal could threaten fragile political arrangements. The ambiguity became dangerous precisely because it allowed followers to imagine renewal in ways leaders could not control. Ambiguity is a gift to the hopeful and a threat to the powerful. You step again into the streets of Jerusalem in your mind, listening to murmurs as people discuss his teachings. Some whisper of miracles. Others speak cautiously, uncertain about the implications. A few question whether he might indeed be the one their ancestors longed for. Each whisper becomes part of a broader atmosphere, shaping how leaders perceived risk. You realize that perception matters just as much as reality. If leaders believed that his language could ignite memories of rebellion or stir dreams of liberation, then ambiguity itself became a form of danger. Another detail surfaces that rarely receives attention: the tendency of ancient audiences to interpret symbolic acts as prophetic declarations. When he healed, it wasn't seen as a medical gesture, but as a sign of divine favor. When he welcomed marginalized people, it wasn't only compassion, it suggested a reordering of society. Combined with phrases hinting at a coming transformation, these gestures could imply a shift in authority not confined to spiritual dimensions. In a world where every sign carried layered meaning, actions and words intertwined to create impressions that leaders could not easily dismiss. Your thoughts return to the question of how Rome interpreted messianic vocabulary. Roman officials were not fluent in Jewish prophecy, but they were fluent in identifying potential threats. Any language suggesting kingship, however symbolic, could be read as sedition if it inspired public loyalty. Even the suggestion of a charismatic figure capable of mobilizing support was enough to warrant attention. The combination of miracles teachings and ambiguous kingdom language created a portrait that defied easy categorization. To authorities, uncertainty itself was a liability. You then revisit an earlier realization: symbols during the procession carried meanings tied to past uprisings. That detail deepens your understanding of how messianic language intersected with the city's volatile memory. Even if Jesus used terms in a peaceful, restorative sense, people raised under occupation might have heard echoes of resistance. Leaders anticipating unrest during crowded festivals could easily interpret such echoes as warnings. Your mind lingers on the softer moments described about him, moments of blessing, teaching, feeding, comforting. These reveal a man focused on healing rather than political strategy. And yet, in a land longing for deliverance, those very acts might have taken on political overtones. A teacher who restores bodies and spirits invites trust. Trust invites loyalty. Loyalty, especially among large crowds, invites scrutiny from those who govern by balancing fear and hope. You sense again how ambiguity becomes not only a feature of his message, but a force shaping the responses around him. The inability to categorize him precisely might have unsettled leaders who depended on predictable social patterns. They needed clear roles, priest, prophet, rebel, teacher, to determine how to react. When someone held multiple layers of meaning simultaneously, the safest path for those in power was often suppression rather than interpretation. As the evening breeze of your imagined Jerusalem cools, you feel how this blend of language, gesture, expectation, and misunderstanding, created a moment where misinterpretation could escalate into action. Ambiguity, once a space for spiritual reflection, became the backdrop for political urgency. And with that shift, the path toward confrontation moved another quiet step forward. You return to the city's heart now, where stone courts echo with footsteps, and where authority is not merely spoken but performed. The temple rises before you, vast and commanding its courtyards, layered with ritual commerce and quiet negotiations that keep the fragile peace intact. Here lies a firmly grounded historical fact. Multiple early sources agree that Jesus caused some form of public disruption within the temple precincts shortly before his arrest. Whether described as overturning tables, driving out merchants, or rebuking the system built into the space, the moment stands as one of the clearest catalysts for the chain of events that followed. Even if the accounts differ in detail, they converge on the idea of deliberate interruption, a symbolic act executed in the most sensitive location imaginable. As you walk into the scene, you feel how this space carried political weight far beyond its religious importance. The temple was not simply a site of sacrifice. It was an engine of revenue, a center of legal authority, and a place where relations with Rome were silently maintained. The high priesthood owed its position not only to lineage, but often to Roman appointment. That unspoken partnership created a complex tension: maintain ritual purity while also maintaining political stability. Any disturbance, however symbolic, threatened to expose the delicate threads tying the city together. You recall how earlier reflections emphasized the temple's dual nature as spiritual sanctuary and administrative institution. Here, that duality becomes starkly visible. You stand at the edge of the outer court, sensing the rhythm of commerce, money changing for temple currency, animals tethered for sacrifice, families preparing offerings. This was life routine necessity. When Jesus disrupted that rhythm even momentarily, he signaled something deeper than frustration with corruption. His act, however peaceful in intent, challenged the infrastructure supporting both religious and political order. You sense why people still debate whether this confrontation was targeted commentary, prophetic gesture, or a spontaneous expression of moral outrage. Each interpretation leads toward a different understanding of motive, and motive shapes how one reads the event's impact. An obscure but fascinating detail emerges when you examine the layout of the temple courts. The area where commerce occurred was not merely a marketplace. It was a controlled space whose activities generated revenue partially used to maintain the priestly aristocracy. That economic dimension often slips beneath the surface of the narrative. Disturbing commerce meant disturbing revenue. Disturbing revenue meant disturbing those who negotiated with Rome to preserve their position. From that vantage, even a symbolic protest could be read not just as moral critique, but as financial interference at a politically charged moment. You watch the disruption unfold in your imagination. Animals scatter coins, roll across stone, startled merchants shout in confusion. The act itself may have lasted only minutes, yet the psychological shock would have reverberated far longer. Crowds watching might have interpreted it as a declaration that the current order was flawed and that authority could be challenged. Leaders watching or hearing reports secondhand would have recognized that anything stirring public emotion inside the temple could not be ignored. You recall earlier discussions of how ambiguous language might generate fear among those who felt the weight of maintaining order. Now you see that ambiguity given form in action. A major scholarly question threads through this moment. Was Jesus attempting to spark reform within the institution? Or was he signaling that the temple's entire structure had outlived its spiritual purpose? Some interpret the gesture as an indictment of corruption. Others see it as a symbolic act, predicting the temple's eventual fall. A smaller group wonders whether it was meant as a claim of prophetic authority. Each interpretation carries implications for how leaders perceived the risk. If authorities believed he was undermining their legitimacy, or even hinting at divine judgment, their urgency to intervene would have increased dramatically. As you linger in the scene, you sense how this confrontation connects to earlier events. The triumphal imagery of his arrival had already raised concerns. The ambiguous kingdom language described before added to the confusion. Here inside the temple, those earlier impressions converge into a concrete act that leaders could use as justification for action. Even if he intended no political rebellion, the optics created a narrative that could be interpreted as defiance. And once a narrative takes shape inside the minds of anxious officials, it becomes difficult to reverse. You picture the meeting rooms where priests and elders gathered afterward. Lamps flicker. Voices remain low. The initial question would not have been theological. It would have been practical. What happens if this gesture encourages larger displays of resistance during the festival? What happens if Rome notices unrest inside the temple courts? The memory of earlier uprisings would hover in the background, reminding them that crowds could transform quickly from worshippers to agitators. You imagine their attention sharpening, their calculations shifting. Passover was already a sensitive time. Any disruption risked scrutiny from the prefect, whose tolerance for disorder was notoriously thin. Another subtle detail becomes relevant here. Roman soldiers were stationed within sight of the temple positioned in the Antonia fortress, so they could intervene quickly if trouble arose. Leaders would have had that proximity in mind. A symbolic act that drew the attention of the crowd might also draw the attention of the stationed troops. In a land where even the possibility of riot could trigger swift reprisal, the safest path for leaders seeking to maintain political stability would have been to neutralize the source of disruption before it escalated. You return your attention to Jesus standing in the aftermath of the confrontation, calm yet resolute. There is no evidence he encouraged violence, no suggestion he attempted to seize control. Yet the calm itself could be interpreted as confidence rooted in authority, an impression that unsettles systems built on predictability. You recall an earlier reflection on how his healing and teaching invited trust. Now that trust becomes more visible as people murmur about what they just witnessed. The connection between compassion and symbolic challenge tightens, forming a portrait of a figure who could not easily be dismissed. Lingering in the memory of that scene, you feel how the confrontation at the temple becomes a hinge moment. It bridges perception and action symbol and interpretation, hope and anxiety. Whether coincidence or catalyst, it marked a turning point in how leaders responded to him. They could no longer view him as merely a wandering teacher. He had stepped into the very center of power and questioned its validity through a gesture that echoed prophetic critique. That act did not need to be violent to be perceived as dangerous. As twilight settles over the temple courts, the disturbance has ended, but the consequences have not. A quiet decision begins forming in hidden rooms, shaped by fear calculation and a determination to preserve stability at all costs. And through that decision, the path toward his arrest edges closer, guided by perceptions that interpreted a symbolic disruption as potential political threat. You step away from the echo of overturned tables and into the quieter corridors where decisions were shaped long before they were spoken aloud. The temple still hums with residual tension, and you sense how the disruption you previously witnessed rippled through the minds of those responsible for preserving order. Their motives were not monolithic. They were layered with fear, responsibility, ambition, and a constant awareness of Rome's unblinking gaze. The first firm historical fact guiding your thoughts is that the high priestly family held real political power under Roman oversight. Their authority depended on maintaining a delicate balance, protect religious life, ensure stability, and prevent any event that might provoke imperial intervention. Stability was not merely a desire, it was a requirement for survival. You imagine the high priest Caiaphas seated among advisors and elders, each carrying the weight of decades shaped by uprisings, negotiations, and compromises. This was not a group that could treat disturbances lightly. You recall how earlier impressions of the temple emphasized its dual identity, and now that complexity deepens. These leaders were guardians of sacred law, yet they also operated as political administrators, navigating an environment where slightest missteps could cost them influence or office. They lived with the memory of Rome's brutal suppression of unrest, and they knew precisely how quickly the prefect could replace a high priest if order faltered. Their motive then emerges not from theological disagreement alone, but from an instinct to prevent political instability. An obscure detail comes into view when you examine the way the high priesthood functioned economically. Much of the temple's financial structure flowed through the hands of elite priestly families whose revenues depended on rituals, offerings, and service fees. This economic influence supported a small aristocratic class tied to both local governance and imperial favor. Disrupting temple commerce, even symbolically, threatened not just theology, but livelihood. The brief chaos caused by Jesus inside the courts would have touched that nerve sharply. What outsiders might interpret as a prophetic gesture, insiders could interpret as a destabilizing challenge to an entire administrative system. When livelihood and authority intertwine, even minor disruptions can feel existential. You walk into the imagined meeting where leaders gather after the incident. The lamplight flickers, casting long shadows against stone walls. Their conversation doesn't begin with accusations of heresy. It begins with practical concerns. Festival crowds are swelling. Rumors of a charismatic teacher are spreading. The temple courts, already strained by festival commerce, have just witnessed a dramatic interruption. You hear murmured questions. What will happen if the people interpret his actions as a call for transformation? What if Rome observes the unrest? What if other groups, those who carried hopes for liberation, more openly attach themselves to his momentum? From this vantage, the open scholarly debate becomes clear. Were these leaders acting primarily out of genuine religious concern, perceiving Jesus as undermining the law, or were their motives driven mainly by political necessity? The debate persists because evidence supports both readings. His critique of temple practices could have been interpreted as theological challenge. Yet the timing, the crowds, the imagery, and the potential for escalation point toward a reaction shaped heavily by political caution. Modern scholarship often stresses the administrative responsibilities of temple leadership, noting that their position required constant vigilance. But how much of their response was fear of Rome, and how much was fear of losing internal authority? The answer remains uncertain, hidden behind centuries of retelling. You feel the atmosphere tighten as you picture their deliberation. They knew the city could become a tinderbox during Passover. They had witnessed uprisings before, some sparked by far smaller gestures. You remember how earlier reflections painted the festival as a moment saturated with symbolic meaning. Now that meaning becomes a burden on the shoulders of those tasked with managing it. A single charismatic figure could turn worship into agitation. Leaders could not risk allowing events to develop organically, not when the potential consequences included Roman intervention or violent suppression. You turn your attention to the relationship between local leaders and the prefect. High priests served at Rome's pleasure. Their authority was only as secure as their usefulness. If a disturbance suggested negligence or complicity, the prefect could remove them swiftly, even violently. This reality would have framed their evaluation of risk. Allowing Jesus to continue drawing crowds within the temple's orbit risked undermining the fragile impression of control they worked hard to maintain. Leaders didn't need certainty of rebellion. They only needed plausible concern. In environments shaped by anxiety and power imbalance, precaution becomes justification. As you trace these concerns, another earlier detail drifts back the ambiguity of Jesus' message, which left listeners interpreting his intentions differently. Leaders facing such ambiguity would have felt the danger of unpredictable movement. If they could not categorize him, they could not predict him. If they could not predict him, they could not manage him. And if they could not manage him, Rome might intervene on the assumption of incompetence. Ambiguity, once a space for hope, now became a catalyst for preemptive strategy. You picture them evaluating additional factors: his growing following, his symbolic gestures, his authority as a teacher outside their control. They might have asked themselves whether he would challenge their influence further, whether he would inspire more symbolic acts, or whether he might speak against them in ways that could erode their standing. Leaders, after all, respond not only to danger, but to perceived loss of authority. The temple's hierarchy operated on reputation as much as ritual. A public challenge, even a symbolic one, risked eroding the confidence of those who depended on them to govern spiritual and civic life. You then imagine them considering the alternative: doing nothing. Ignoring him could allow momentum to build. Intervening too late could lead to unrest. Acting quickly, however, could restore calm and protect their position. This internal negotiation helps you understand how motive can emerge from layers of self-preservation rather than simple opposition. Leaders were not cartoon villains. They were administrators navigating overlapping expectations. Their decisions were shaped by fear, tradition, politics, and a desire to prevent disaster. As the meeting in your mind continues, the air grows heavier. Some leaders might have sympathized with his moral critique, yet still recognized the danger his popularity posed. Others might have felt threatened by his influence more personally. In such a group, motives combine into collective action even if individuals differ in reasoning. And when that action forms, it moves quickly, shaped by urgency rather than theological nuance. When you step back from this imagined room, the motives of the temple authorities appear intertwined with the unfolding events. His public challenge during a politically sensitive festival, his ambiguous message, his growing following, all these elements converged and pushed them toward a decision that felt inevitable from their perspective. Whether catalyst or coincidence, the temple confrontation gave them what they needed: a reason to act before the situation spiraled beyond their control. The city outside quiets as night settles. Inside those guarded chambers, the first steps toward intervention crystallize, shaped by fear of Rome, fear of disorder, and fear that the symbolic challenge inside the temple might grow into something far more destabilizing. You turn now toward the looming presence that hovered over every decision made in Jerusalem, the force that shaped not only political strategy, but even the personal anxieties of the leaders you just left behind. Rome did not need to shout to make its presence felt. It simply remained visible, stationed in stone fortresses, and embodied in the authority of one man whose signature could determine the fate of the entire province. Your thoughts settle on a solid historical foundation. Pontius Pilate served as prefect of Judea with direct responsibility for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring loyalty to the emperor. His tenure was marked by incidents that revealed both harsh judgment and a willingness to deploy violence quickly when he sensed instability. Even ancient sources critical of him acknowledge this tendency. The stability he was charged to maintain, often referred to as the Pax Romana, rested not on goodwill, but on deterrence. You imagine Pilate arriving in Jerusalem for the Passover season, moving from his seaside residence in Caesarea to the fortress overlooking the temple. His relocation alone signals something essential. Roman prefects did not travel to festival crowds out of spiritual interest. They traveled out of caution. The city swelled with pilgrims, many carrying memories of past deliverance and hopes for future liberation. You recall the earlier image of Jerusalem as a container of both devotion and dissatisfaction, a place where symbolism could ignite unrest with surprising speed. Pilate would have viewed that atmosphere not as sacred celebration, but as risk management in motion. Your attention shifts to the fortress where Roman soldiers stood above the temple courts. From that vantage, everything below was visible: the crowds, the commerce, the ceremonial processions, and any disruption that broke the expected rhythm. When reports of a charismatic teacher causing disturbance inside the temple reached Pilate, they would not have been evaluated through theological nuance. Instead, they would have been filtered through the practical lens of imperial priorities. Rome tolerated local customs, as long as those customs supported stability. Anything that hinted at social agitation, even indirectly registered as potential sedition. A little-known but revealing detail appears when you explore Roman administrative practices. Prefects were evaluated not by local approval, but by their ability to prevent unrest and protect revenue. Judea had a history of uprisings, making it a province requiring careful oversight. Failures to maintain order could stall a prefect's career or even lead to recall. This bureaucratic pressure lies beneath Pilate's actions. He did not need to dislike Jesus personally, nor even understand the intricacies of Jewish religious debate. He only needed to detect a potential spark in a flammable environment. And he would have been well aware that Passover had previously been a moment when revolt could flare. You let your gaze drift across the city from Pilate's imagined perspective. The earlier procession into Jerusalem with its palm branches and celebratory tone would have looked suspicious, not sacred. Crowds lining the road shouting phrases of deliverance surrounding a teacher whose reputation preceded him could resemble the early formation of a movement. Even if Pilate lacked understanding of messianic language, he likely understood the danger of large, enthusiastic gatherings centered on a single figure. Rome interpreted public loyalty to anyone other than the emperor as a problem waiting to unfold. A recurring scholarly debate enters your thoughts. Was Pilate naturally cruel and inflexible as some sources portray, or was he a pragmatic administrator shaped by circumstance? The answer remains contested because accounts describe him in radically different ways. Philo and Josephus depict a harsh and insensitive ruler, prone to unnecessary brutality, while the gospel narratives present a more hesitant figure who seems reluctant to condemn Jesus. These portrayals are not easily reconciled. Some suggest that the gospel authors softened his character to shift responsibility toward local leaders, while others argue that Pilate could be both ruthless and politically cautious, tailoring his responses to situations rather than relying on a single consistent style. This debate highlights the challenge of interpreting his motives through fragmentary, conflicting lenses. You return to the environment he governed. Roman rule in Judea was not gentle. Taxes were heavy, soldiers patrolled strategically, and public punishment served as a reminder of the empire's reach. Crucifixion, the penalty ultimately involved here, was reserved primarily for rebel slaves and those accused of crimes against the state. That fact alone forces you to reconsider earlier impressions. If Rome chose this form of execution, it suggests that the authorities, whether influenced by temple leaders or guided by their own assessment, interpreted Jesus through a political lens. Rome did not crucify wandering preachers merely for challenging religious practices. It crucified threats. You recall how ambiguity surrounded Jesus' message and how symbolic acts inside the temple unsettled local leaders. For Pilate, ambiguity would have posed an administrative inconvenience. He needed clarity to manage risk, and ambiguity meant unpredictable potential. The temple authorities approaching him with concerns would have framed the situation in terms that emphasized potential for unrest. They knew how to appeal to Roman priorities. They would not have highlighted theological disputes. They would have emphasized public danger. The partnership between Rome and the high priestly families created a shared incentive to avoid chaos at all costs. You imagine Pilate listening to reports delivered by informants stationed throughout the city. These informants would have tracked public sentiment, noting rumors, gatherings, and conversations that hinted at dissatisfaction with Roman authority. A teacher drawing crowds, challenging the temple system, and inspiring symbolic gestures during a volatile festival would become part of those reports. Even if Jesus intended nothing, political perception held greater weight. Pilate, familiar with the province's history, likely recognized how quickly spiritual expectation could morph into political fervor. An obscure administrative detail adds another layer. Roman prefects often made decisions swiftly to prevent escalation even when evidence was limited. They preferred preemption to reaction. Waiting for disorder meant failing to prevent it. That mindset helps you understand how Pilate might have approached the situation. He did not need absolute certainty of rebellion. He only needed credible concern voiced by local leaders. Credibility in this context stemmed from shared fears and the high priest's political insight. A recommendation from the temple authorities would carry weight, especially if framed as a preventative measure. You sense how earlier events form a chain leading toward this moment. The crowds at the procession revealed public enthusiasm. The ambiguous language stirred questions among those trained to notice symbolic danger. The confrontation in the temple disrupted the core institution that maintained order. Now Pilate enters the frame as a figure whose priorities align with preemptive stability. You feel how each piece begins to link, forming an environment where decisive action felt not only justified, but necessary. As you linger with this image of Rome's watchful presence, the atmosphere feels heavier. Pilate did not need to fully understand Jesus to react strongly. He simply needed to believe that doing nothing risked disorder. And in Rome's world, disorder could never be tolerated. You move now into the dim interior of the Praetorium, that austere space where Roman power condensed into a single man and a single decision that would echo across centuries. Pilate stands at the center of this moment, not as the villain of later imagination, nor as the reluctant bureaucrat softened by later narratives, but as a prefect navigating the razor-thin line between imperial duty and local volatility. Before you picture him weighing moral concerns, you anchor yourself in a crucial historical fact. Roman governors were expected to resolve disturbances swiftly, publicly, and decisively, often staging their judgments as performances meant to reaffirm imperial authority. Justice in this world was inseparable from spectacle. You sense the tension in the room, not loud or dramatic, but taut like a rope drawn from opposite directions. Pilate has already heard reports, a teacher drawing crowds, creating symbolic disturbance in the temple, inspiring ambiguous phrases that could be interpreted as claims to authority. He likely knew little about Jesus personally. What he understood was risk. You recall how earlier reflections emphasized Rome's preference for preemptive action. That instinct becomes even sharper here, where Pilate's reputation, career, and relationship with the emperor all depend on a single consistent skill preventing unrest before it ignites. A more obscure detail threads its way into your thoughts. Pilate's administrative record includes several documented clashes with the Jewish populace incidents involving military standards, bearing imperial images, the use of temple funds for construction projects, and crowd dispersals that ended in bloodshed. These moments, described vividly by ancient historians, paint a portrait of a man whose responses to tension were often heavy-handed. Yet they also reveal someone sensitive to criticism from Rome. After previous misjudgments, he would have been wary of any situation that might be reported upward as negligence. This combination of harshness and insecurity forms the ground on which the dilemma surrounding Jesus takes shape. You imagine him questioning Jesus, though the sources preserve the exchange in slightly different forms. Pilate asks whether he is a king not out of theological curiosity, but because political identity determines political consequence. The answer Jesus offers, layered with the same ambiguity that has followed him throughout earlier reflections, only deepens the tension. A kingdom not of this world might sound harmless to modern ears, but to Pilate, the statement may have sounded evasive. When meanings are unclear, officials trained to expect deception or rebellion tend to assume the worst. The earlier echo of ambiguity now returns with heavier implications. Pilate's hesitation, described in some accounts, does not necessarily indicate sympathy. It may represent calculation. Executing a popular figure risked backlash. Releasing someone viewed by the authorities as dangerous risked unrest. The dilemma was not between mercy and severity. It was between competing risks. You sense Pilate evaluating which path minimized the chance of riot, protest, or Roman reprimand. His judgment would not be shaped by personal conviction, but by political necessity. A long-standing scholarly debate surfaces here, one that continues to ripple through historical studies. Did Pilate initially view Jesus as insignificant and only act under pressure from temple authorities? Or did he perceive independent political danger from the situation? Arguments flow on both sides. Some point to Pilate's previous acts of insensitivity, suggesting he would not have considered local leaders' concerns without his own reasons. Others highlight how early narratives portray him as reluctant, implying that local leaders manipulated him through political leverage. The truth likely lies between these positions. Pilate may have seen the situation as manageable, but also recognized that ignoring the concerns of local elites risked alienating the very partners he relied on to govern effectively. You picture the growing crowd outside the Praetorium. Voices rise not in coordinated protest, but in restless tension. Pilate, accustomed to reading such atmospheres, would have understood that the longer the matter lingered unresolved, the more the crowd's mood could shift. He needed to act quickly, yet his uncertainty clouded the decision. The possibility that Jesus' followers might interpret release as triumph and therefore become emboldened could not be ignored. You remember the imagery of the triumphal entry, how crowds welcomed Jesus with gestures reminiscent of liberation. That memory might have weighed on Pilate's mind, whether consciously or through the reports he received. In this charged atmosphere, Pilate turns to a customary act performed during festivals, the release of a prisoner. Whether historically accurate or a later narrative device, the gesture reveals something deeper about political theater. Public acts of mercy allowed Rome to appear benevolent while reinforcing its power. By offering the crowd a choice, Pilate may have sought both a test and a justification. If they rejected Jesus, the decision to execute him would appear less like Roman imposition and more like communal consent. If they supported him, Pilate could claim he had listened, yet still intervene if he judged the risk too great. The moment becomes a performance for the crowd, for the temple authorities, and for Rome. You watch Pilate move between indoor questioning and outdoor proclamations, a rhythm that emphasizes performance. Trials of politically sensitive figures often unfolded as staged events. The prefect steps out, announces charges or findings, listens to reactions, and returns inside to deliberate. Each movement shapes public perception. Pilate would have understood that how he handled this moment mattered nearly as much as the outcome. Appear too lenient, and he risked emboldening potential agitators. Appear too harsh without justification, and he risked sparking anger during a volatile festival. A faint memory from earlier observations returns the proximity of Roman soldiers stationed within sight of the temple. Their presence lingered behind every decision made that week. Pilate had the military force to suppress unrest, but suppression during a major festival would risk widespread backlash. His dilemma then was not about choosing violence or restraint. It was about choosing the version of violence or restraint that preserved order most effectively. Another obscure aspect of Roman governance deepens your understanding. Prefects were expected to demonstrate their authority through ritualized actions such as the public washing of hands described in one account. While historians debate whether this gesture occurred historically or symbolically, the imagery captures something real about Roman rule leaders used symbolic acts to manage public emotion. Even a gesture of reluctance could serve to deflect anger away from the state and toward other parties. As Pilate moves toward his decision, you sense the cumulative weight of earlier developments, the ambiguous teachings, the swelling crowds, the temple disturbance, and the warnings from local authorities who understood the cultural landscape better than he did. These threads tighten around him as he chooses the path that promises the least immediate instability. Whether he believed Jesus guilty or merely dangerous hardly matters. In a world where perception drives policy, Pilate needed only to believe that executing him would restore equilibrium. When the final decision is announced, it comes less as a moral judgment than as a political calculation. The prefect asserts authority before the watching crowd, demonstrating Rome's readiness to act and its willingness to collaborate with local leadership. The trial concludes not as a search for truth, but as a performance designed to preserve order. And through that performance, Pilate becomes not the reluctant figure softened by later reflection, but a governor navigating the demands of power in a volatile land. As you let the praetorium fade, the realization settles over you gently. Pilate's dilemma was never truly about guilt or innocence. It was about maintaining the fragile Pax Romana one calculated gesture at a time. You step away from the charged atmosphere of the praetorium and drift into a quieter, more intricate web of relationships that rarely appears in simplified retellings. The trial you have been following did not unfold in isolation. It grew from a network of cooperation and tension between two governing bodies forced into an uneasy partnership, the temple leadership and the Roman administration. The first historical fact anchoring your thoughts is that Judea operated under a system of shared governance. Rome retained ultimate authority, but it relied heavily on the high priestly aristocracy to manage daily affairs, adjudicate religious law, and monitor public sentiment. This arrangement allowed the empire to maintain control without exhausting its resources. In return, temple authorities received political stability, so long as they kept unrest contained. You imagine the corridors of power running parallel to one another. Roman stone halls on one side, temple chambers on the other. Messages traveled between them through intermediaries, guards, and informants. Neither side fully trusted the other, yet both depended on that fragile relationship. You recall from earlier how the temple leaders feared Roman intervention during the Passover crowd swell. Now you begin to see how mutual convenience shaped the response to Jesus. If he represented even a faint risk of mobilizing a crowd, both institutions had incentives to act swiftly. An obscure detail slips into view when you examine the Roman administrative structure more closely. Rome frequently used local elites as buffers between the empire and the people. In Judea, this meant that the high priestly families held unusual influence, effectively functioning as Rome's eyes and ears within the religious community. The appointment of the high priest was not simply a spiritual decision, it was a political one. High priests could be installed or removed depending on their usefulness, a fact recorded by ancient historians and often glossed over in popular storytelling. This arrangement formed the foundation for collaboration that was subtle, pragmatic, and occasionally reluctant. You picture a quiet meeting between representatives of the temple leadership and Roman officials after the temple disturbance described earlier. The temple authorities would have reported the incident, carefully framing it not as theological disagreement, but as a potential threat to public order. Rome did not intervene in doctrinal disputes, but it intervened aggressively in anything resembling sedition. You sense how language would have been shaped strategically in these exchanges. No one needed to claim that Jesus sought rebellion. They only needed to suggest that the crowd's reaction implied danger. In that suggestion, Pilate and the temple authorities found shared ground. A long-standing scholarly debate now unfolds before you, like a slow-turning scroll. Did the temple leaders initiate the process of arrest and trial to protect their authority, or were they pressured by Rome to contain a potential destabilizer? Some argue that temple authorities acted preemptively, hoping to prevent the prefect from stepping in and disrupting the festival. Others propose that Rome signaled its concern, indirectly prompting local leaders to handle the matter quickly. The debate persists because evidence from the period reveals a pattern of mutual influence. Sometimes Rome nudged. Sometimes the temple authorities anticipated the nudge. Their collaboration was less conspiratorial than practical, shaped by shared anxiety about maintaining peace. Your mind drifts back to details explored earlier, the symbolism of the triumphal entry, the ambiguity of Jesus' teachings, the confrontation in the temple courts. Each of these moments would have contributed to discussions between the two governing bodies. Even if their interpretations differed, they converged on one point: Passover was not the time to allow uncertainty to grow. You sense how fear, not malice, often motivates cooperation between unequal powers. The temple leaders wanted to preserve autonomy. Pilate wanted to avoid unrest that might damage his reputation. Both sides recognized that decisive action now could prevent greater trouble later. Another subtle but telling detail emerges when you consider the timing of Jesus' arrest. Several accounts suggest it occurred at night, away from crowds likely to prevent public demonstration. This timing reveals coordination. Neither side wanted to provoke a confrontation in the streets where enthusiasm could transform into resistance. Arresting him quietly reduced the risk of spectacle, allowing the matter to be resolved before dawn. You picture officers moving through narrow alleyways carrying torches that cast long shadows. This was not improvisation. It was strategy. You let your thoughts drift into the mindset of the temple aristocracy. They lived at the intersection of ancient tradition and imperial oversight, knowing that Rome's tolerance had limits. Earlier reflections on revenue and ritual now deepen your perception. Protecting the temple system required navigating Roman expectations carefully. When a figure appeared who challenged authority symbolically and attracted large crowds, the leadership could not afford to ignore him. Even if some among them sympathized with his critique or found nothing personally threatening in his teachings, the collective responsibility to preserve order overshadowed individual sentiment. Rome, for its part, relied on those leaders to interpret cultural nuance. Pilate lacked deep familiarity with Jewish prophecy or the emotional texture of messianic expectation. He depended on the high priestly class to read the situation and advise him. This dependency created a power dynamic, not unlike the relationship between a general and his local scouts. Rome had the military strength. The temple authorities had the cultural knowledge. Neither side held complete control, but together they formed a system capable of responding to perceived danger swiftly. You sense the quiet maneuvering between the two groups growing more intricate. Reports circulate from the temple courts to the fortress, then from the fortress back to the temple chambers. Decisions solidify not through formal agreements, but through a subtle alignment of priorities. Both sides needed calm. Both sides feared crowds. Both sides recognized that Passover magnified every risk. A more obscure aspect of collaboration appears when you consider the role of informants. Rome employed local spies who listened for rumors of revolt. Some scholars speculate that the temple authorities maintained similar networks to gauge public sentiment. These networks sometimes overlapped. It is not hard to imagine information about Jesus, his movements, his followers, his actions flowing through channels both formal and informal. Even silence can be reported as potential danger. In environments shaped by tension, the absence of clarity becomes suspicious in itself. You recall the earlier acknowledgement that Rome used crucifixion primarily for political crimes. That detail now sharpens the collaborative dimension. The temple leaders did not possess authority to crucify. That power belonged solely to Rome. For Jesus to be condemned in this manner, both parties had to participate in the process, whether explicitly or implicitly. Collaboration then was not optional. It was built into the legal and political structure of the province. As you let this intricate network settle around you, the picture becomes clearer. The trial was not driven by a single entity acting in isolation. It emerged from an intersection of fears, responsibilities, and strategic decisions made by two governing bodies whose interests overlapped at just the right moment. Their collaboration may not have been warm or trusting, but it was effective. And through that collaboration, the path toward execution became less a question of theology and more a question of maintaining a fragile equilibrium. The night grows still in your mind. Somewhere between the fortress and the temple courts, a decision has crystallized, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet alignment. Two powers bound by necessity have decided to move in the same direction. You ease into the next layer of the story, stepping softly into a world where law and custom should have provided clarity, yet instead offer only fractured paths and narrowing corridors. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the rustle of garments, the shuffle of sandals, and the hushed exchanges moving through halls where justice was meant to be rendered with deliberation rather than haste. What stands out first, like a lantern steadying your gaze, is a solid historical fact. Jewish legal proceedings of the period generally required trials to occur during daylight and to be conducted with deliberate, orderly testimony. Likewise, Roman judicial protocol emphasized clear charges, formal accusations, and structured hearings. Yet the accounts surrounding the trial of Jesus seem to move with a strange, irregular rhythm, as though the process rushed ahead of itself in the dark. You imagine following the path taken after his night arrest, winding through alleyways until you reach a gathering of elders and priests, assembled not in the daylight of the temple courts, but in a more private setting. The timing alone would have raised questions for anyone familiar with judicial norms. Night hours were typically reserved for rest, not verdicts. You recall how earlier reflections described the anxiety gripping temple authorities during the festival, especially after the disturbances inside the temple. In that light, the urgency of these nighttime deliberations begins to feel less like legal necessity and more like political pressure quietly rearranging established routines. As you enter the room, you sense the atmosphere thickened by fatigue and tension. Testimony is offered, yet the sources recall contradictions and shifting statements. That inconsistency creates one of the obscure details often mentioned by scholars. Witnesses appear unable to align their accounts clearly enough to satisfy formal requirements. The irregularity alone suggests that the process was not moving according to ideal procedure. Instead, it seems shaped by a desire to reach a conclusion swiftly before crowds could gather or rumors could spread. You notice how earlier observations about leaders seeking to prevent unrest now echo through this moment, making the irregularities feel less like mistakes and more like calculated concessions to urgency. An open scholarly debate rises gently in your mind. Were these proceedings intended as a formal trial or a preliminary hearing designed merely to prepare charges for the Roman prefect? Some argue the gathering functioned as a kind of internal investigation rather than a final judgment. Others insist it aimed to reach a verdict before presenting the case to Pilate. The ambiguity matters because it exposes the difficulty of interpreting events through sources shaped by theological motives and written decades later. Yet regardless of the exact legal category, the procedural anomalies remain striking. You sense how the irregular timing, the hurried testimonies, and the lack of clear evidence reveal a process more concerned with outcome than structure. You drift back briefly to the earlier reflection on collaboration between temple leaders and Roman authorities. That partnership forms a quiet backdrop here. You imagine the leaders aware that Rome required concrete charges framed in political terms, accusations connected to sedition, kingship claims, or threats to order. Jewish religious disputes would not concern Pilate. Thus, the allegations presented during the internal proceedings likely had to be shaped in ways that translated spiritual concerns into political language. This translation alone would have strained ordinary legal procedure, bending the process into a shape that served political priorities rather than judicial clarity. Your thoughts shift to the formal expectations of Roman law. Rome typically required accusers to present clear legal claims, witnesses to provide coherent testimony, and defendants to respond in a structured manner. Yet when Jesus stands before Pilate, the charges appear already distilled into a simplified political form. Claims of kingship, implications of forbidden authority, suggestions of public influence that could spark unrest. The shift from religious allegations to political accusations feels abrupt, a sign of how the internal irregularities smoothed the path toward a more Roman-friendly charge. That transformation would have required coordination and urgency, not slow, careful procedure. Another subtle detail emerges as you picture Pilate questioning him. Roman governors conducted hearings publicly, often in open-air settings where citizens or petitioners could observe. The trial in this sense becomes performance as much as process. Yet even here, irregularity appears. The accounts suggest quick transitions, brief exchanges, and decisions unfolding faster than formal protocol might demand. You remember from earlier how political theater shaped Pilate's actions. Now you see how legal procedure becomes another stage one designed not to uncover truth, but to project stability. You step once more into the dim chamber where the initial gathering took place, sensing how the leaders might have felt constrained by both time and fear. They needed to maintain the appearance of legitimacy while also ensuring the process didn't unravel under the weight of public scrutiny. In such a context, irregularities become understandable, even predictable. You imagine the elders glancing toward windows where the first hints of dawn might soon appear, each minute increasing the risk of crowd involvement. The urgency to reach a decision before morning amplifies every procedural compromise. You notice how this environment resonates with earlier reflections on ambiguity and misinterpretation. Ambiguity surrounded not only Jesus' teachings, but now the judicial process itself. Testimonies that don't align, charges reframed for Roman ears, and proceedings held at inappropriate hours all create a texture of uncertainty. That uncertainty raises a quiet question: were the leaders attempting to follow law as best they could under pressure, or were they intentionally bending it toward a predetermined outcome? Scholars differ in their readings, and the sources remain silent on motive. Yet the irregularities speak softly of a process shaped more by fear than fairness. As dawn edges closer in your imagination, you picture the group preparing to deliver Jesus to Pilate. The transition from Jewish authority to Roman jurisdiction requires another layer of legal adaptation. Rome controlled capital punishment. Only Pilate could authorize execution, especially crucifixion. Thus, the leaders needed to present their case in a form that would resonate with Roman priorities. Religious accusations would not suffice. Political accusations had to emerge. This necessity likely drove the shift from discussions of blasphemy to implications of kingship, an irregular yet strategically useful reframing. You allow your thoughts to settle on the broader implications of these procedural deviations. They reveal not simply legal shortcomings, but a system under stress, trying to operate within established guidelines, while influenced by fear of unrest and concern for political survival. A process meant to convey stability instead reflects instability at every turn, and within that instability, the lines between justice and expedience blur quietly, almost imperceptibly, until the outcome feels less like a legal judgment and more like a precautionary measure taken under pressure. As you leave the dim chamber and step into the faint morning light, you feel how the irregularities form another link in the chain. Not definitive proof of conspiracy, but evidence of a system bending beneath the weight of political anxiety. And through that bending, the path toward execution narrows further, guided by motives that blend fear, urgency, and the quiet erosion of formal procedure. You move now into the delicate moment when words become weapons, when accusations are shaped not to describe reality, but to define it. Charges, after all, are not neutral statements. They are interpretations with consequences attached. And here, as you hover between the temple chambers and the Roman praetorium, you begin to see how language was molded to bridge two systems of authority that rarely spoke the same legal dialect. The first historical fact guiding your steps is clear: under Roman occupation, only Rome could authorize capital punishment, especially crucifixion. Any accusation meant to lead to such an outcome had to be political. Claims of blasphemy or ritual violation would carry no weight in a Roman court. The charges needed to sound dangerous to the state. You watch as religious concerns begin to shift into political terminology, the way a stream joins a larger river and changes its flow entirely. Inside the Jewish leadership's internal discussions, accusations may have centered on perceived threats to religious authority teachings that challenged purity laws, symbols that questioned institutional power, or gestures like the temple disruption. Yet when the matter reached Pilate, the framing transformed. Now the allegation resembled sedition. He claimed authority, or was perceived to claim authority in ways that threatened the emperor's jurisdiction. The phrasing became sharper and more strategic. Any hint of kingship, even symbolic or spiritual, could be framed as political insubordination. You remember how earlier reflections emphasized the ambiguity surrounding his message. Now that ambiguity becomes a pivot, allowing opponents to interpret metaphor as menace. An obscure detail rises gently into place when you consider the legal categories used in Roman jurisprudence. Romans had a charge called maiestas, a broad, flexible accusation encompassing any act that diminished the dignity or authority of the emperor. It could include rebellion, sedition, or simply influencing people in a way Rome found suspicious. This category was notoriously malleable, useful for confronting threats, real or perceived. While the sources do not explicitly name this charge in the trial, its shadow hangs over the proceedings. If temple leaders approached Pilate framing Jesus as someone who stirred public enthusiasm or garnered loyalty that might rival imperial authority, Pilate would have heard echoes of maiestas. It was one of the easiest charges to raise and one of the hardest for a defendant to refute, especially if the defendant tended to answer questions with a level of poetic subtlety that made bureaucrats nervous. You can almost picture Pilate listening, thinking, "Please just give me a straightforward yes or no. One of your gentle jokes for the evening, a subtle nudge in the ribs of history's least patient administrator." Your thoughts drift into the heart of a long-standing scholarly debate. Did Jesus openly claim a form of kingship that could be understood politically? Or were these accusations entirely constructed by opponents who reinterpreted his teachings for strategic effect? Some historians argue that his references to a coming kingdom implied authority beyond the spiritual realm, making political suspicion inevitable. Others insist his message focused on divine transformation, with no intention of rivaling earthly governance. The ambiguity ricochets across centuries because the sources preserve both spiritual imagery and implications that could be weaponized. You recall earlier observations about messianic language, how layered meanings could mislead even well-intentioned listeners. Now you see how those layers provided fertile ground for accusations to take shape. You imagine Pilate scrutinizing the charges, trying to determine whether this man represented genuine danger. He would not care whether Jesus offended religious sensibilities. He cared about crowds' influence and the potential for unrest. Pilate's conversation with Jesus, portrayed in various forms, circles around kingship, because kingship is actionable. If he claimed to be a king, even metaphorically, Pilate could justify execution. If he denied political intention, yet inspired followers to speak of deliverance, Pilate could still claim precaution. You recall earlier reflections about the triumphal entry, where imagery walked the line between devotion and defiance. That memory surely echoed in Pilate's mind, whether through direct reports or through the anxious framing offered by temple authorities. Another subtle detail appears when you examine the cultural interplay between accusation and expectation. In a society where messianic hope mingled with political frustration, rumors of a potential liberator could spread quickly. Leaders did not need public declarations to suspect danger. They needed only murmurs. The charge then becomes both a description and a prediction. If he continues gathering followers and symbolism continues to surround him, rebellion might emerge. By framing him as a potential instigator, authorities could justify preemptive action. It's a bit like telling yourself you're cleaning your house in case guests come over, even though the guests have not been invited and may not exist. Your second soft joke, domestic anxiety meets ancient politics. As you listen to the charges forming, you recognize how the process mirrors earlier irregularities observed in the nighttime proceedings. The objective was not to pursue clarity, but to find a charge that would translate effectively across two legal systems. Religious disputes needed to be reframed as political threats. Ambiguous teachings needed to be interpreted as subversive claims. Symbolic gestures needed to be recast as agitation. You sense how these reinterpretations flowed naturally from the anxiety both governing bodies shared. Each one feared disorder, and disorder required a culprit. The framing of charges also reveals something about the internal dynamics of power. Temple authorities needed Rome to authorize execution. Rome needed temple authorities to interpret cultural context. This mutual dependency shaped the language of accusation. You imagine leaders choosing their words, carefully emphasizing the potential for crowd mobilization, highlighting the imagery associated with kingship, and downplaying the theological subtlety that might have made their concerns seem less urgent. Pilate, hearing these reframed allegations, sees not a preacher, but a possible catalyst for unrest. Your mind drifts momentarily to the crowd. Public reaction could shape political perception. If the crowd viewed Jesus as a figure of hope, then in Pilate's eyes, he became more dangerous. If the crowd turned indifferent or hostile, Pilate's decision became easier. The charge of kingship thus operated as a rhetorical bridge connecting popular enthusiasm with political anxiety. One accusation carried both practical and symbolic power. You allow a final, gentle observation to surface your third joke, arriving softly. If ancient political communication had a customer service department, phrases like, "He claims to be a king," would have been placed under the category of statements, guaranteed to escalate your case. You let the humor dissolve quietly, mindful of the gravity beneath it. As you step back from the evolving portrait of accusation, you feel how the framing of charges shaped the entire narrative that followed. They transformed a spiritual teacher into a political threat, not necessarily because he sought such a role, but because his presence touched sensitive nerves in a tense, occupied land. Words became interpretations, interpretations became fears, and fears became justification. And through those charges, strategically framed, quietly sharpened, the trial moved one step closer to its irreversible conclusion. You step now into the shifting, unpredictable landscape of public sentiment, an element as potent as any authority figure, yet harder to measure and nearly impossible to control. If earlier moments unfolded in chambers and courtyards, where leaders whispered and strategized, this one takes place in the open air among crowds whose mood could change with a gesture, a rumor, or the simple momentum of collective emotion. You begin with a firm historical fact. Jerusalem during Passover swelled to several times its usual population, drawing pilgrims from across Judea and beyond. With so many voices gathered in such tight quarters, public opinion became both a force to monitor and a danger to anticipate. Leaders in both the temple hierarchy and Roman administration knew this, and they navigated the mood of the crowd as carefully as they navigated legal proceedings. As you drift through the swelling noise of festival markets, you recall earlier scenes where Jesus' arrival drew public enthusiasm, palm branches, waving shouts rising like sparks. That memory hangs in the air, a reminder that crowds had once responded to him with warmth and expectation. Yet crowds, as anyone who has ever attended a mildly rowdy concert knows, do not maintain a single emotional tone for long. They shift, swirl, falter, and surge. Leaders understood this volatility deeply. Even the faintest suggestion of unrest could turn festival joy into something far more dangerous. You picture temple officers watching for subtle signs, a change in chant cadence, a ripple of bodies turning a murmur spreading too quickly. Maintaining calm required vigilance, and vigilance required shaping public sentiment before it began shaping events. Into this delicate balance enters an obscure detail seldom emphasized. Ancient leaders often used public declarations, controlled crowds, and staged moments of persuasion to direct collective mood. These were not modern propaganda campaigns. They were smaller, more immediate efforts, timed announcements, selective testimony, strategic use of supporters placed within the crowd. The gospel narratives, despite their differing perspectives, all hint at some form of public influence, shaping the final scene before Pilate. Whether through carefully chosen voices or through the organic crowd, anxiety building during festival season, The people gathered outside the praetorium participated in the performance. Their reactions, shaped by timing and tension, became part of the machinery guiding the prefect's decision. You let your mind drift into that courtyard. The morning air is cool, but tension rises with the sun. Pilgrims shuffle forward, curious about the commotion. Some may have followed Jesus earlier. Others may have merely heard rumors. A crowd is not a single organism. It is a collection of individuals reacting to what they think others believe. A whisper becomes a murmur becomes a wave, and a wave becomes something leaders can redirect with surprisingly little effort. You recall earlier reflections on how ambiguous teachings, symbolic actions, and the temple confrontation stirred concern among authorities. Now those concerns converge in a moment where public perception must be managed with precision. A long-standing scholarly debate surfaces floating through your thoughts like a drifting incense trail. To what extent did temple authorities intentionally influence the crowd? And to what extent did the crowd act according to its own anxieties and expectations? Some scholars argue that leaders planted influential voices to guide the atmosphere, shifting excitement into skepticism. Others suggest that the crowd's shift in attitude reflected disappointment. Perhaps Jesus had not acted with the decisive power some hoped for. Still others propose that the crowd assembled outside Pilate's praetorium was not the same crowd that welcomed Jesus days earlier, but a smaller group convened by circumstance. The debate remains unresolved because the sources shaped by theological and narrative motives offer tantalizing glimpses but no definitive clarity. Whatever the precise cause, you sense how the mood crystallized into something Pilate could interpret as public consensus. Leaders understood that the prefect needed not merely justification, but reassurance. If the crowd appeared unified, or at least not resistant, Pilate could make a decision without fearing immediate riot. You imagine him stepping out before them, listening to rising chants, watching the emotional shift that happens when a group senses its own power. Even a small number of loud voices can influence a hesitant crowd. It's the ancient equivalent of someone clapping too enthusiastically at a meeting, prompting others to join simply because silence feels awkward. A light joke, but one rooted in very real human behavior. You notice how earlier reflections on collaboration reveal themselves here in subtle ways. The temple authorities needed Pilate to act swiftly, but they also needed the crowd to accept the outcome. Public approval, or at least acquiescence, protected them from appearing complicit in Roman action. If the crowd joined in calling for execution, responsibility dispersed across collective sentiment. Pilate, too, benefited from this diffusion. When the crowd appeared to demand the outcome, he could present his judgment as responsive rather than imposed. Public opinion thus became a buffer, absorbing blame and dispersing accountability. An obscure but illuminating detail emerges from Roman political culture. Public spectacle played a significant role in maintaining imperial control. Announcements, trials, punishments, these were not private matters. They were performed before the people, who served as both witnesses and instruments of social reinforcement. In this sense, the crowd's reaction was not incidental but integral. Their approval, whether spontaneous or shaped, contributed to the legitimacy of Rome's actions. Pilate would have recognized this dynamic instinctively. A public that voiced its preference created a narrative of necessity, one he could adopt to justify his decision upward within the imperial hierarchy. As you watch the crowd shift, you sense how fragile the moment truly was. Public sentiment does not always reflect deeply held convictions. Sometimes it reflects fear, confusion, or the simple pressure of collective noise. In the courtyard, people may have wondered what version of Jesus they were confronting: a healer, a teacher, a prophet, or someone portrayed as a political agitator. Charges shape perception. Perception shapes emotion, and emotion shapes the trajectory of crowd behavior. You remember how earlier reflections emphasized ambiguity. Now that ambiguity becomes a tool for persuasion, allowing accusations to fill the gaps. A second soft joke flickers gently to life. If ancient Judeans had possessed comment sections, the tone might have shifted just as quickly, confusion at the top, shouting by the middle, resignation by the end. You let the humor pass lightly, aware that beneath it lies a truth about how unpredictable group reactions can be. As you step back from the courtyard, the role of public opinion becomes clearer. It did not determine the outcome alone, but it shaped the environment in which decisions were made. It provided justification for leaders and cover for Rome. It amplified certain voices while silencing others. And it revealed how the trial became not only a legal or political event, but a social drama performed before an unpredictable audience. By the time Pilate acted, the mood of the crowd had become part of the machinery driving the decision. Whether cultivated or organic, influenced or spontaneous, the shift in public sentiment helped transform possibility into inevitability. And through that transformation, the path toward execution narrowed even further. Guided not only by leaders and laws, but by the murmuring, swaying, emotionally charged voice of the people. You leave the crowd behind, now stepping into a quieter, more enigmatic space, one filled not with shouting or spectacle, but with absence. Silence, you discover, can be as revealing as any testimony. In trials shaped by fear, urgency, and political maneuvering, the voices that go missing often tell their own kind of story. And so you begin with a firm historical fact. None of the direct followers of Jesus appear in any surviving account as providing testimony in his defense during the proceedings. Whatever their reasons, their absence stands in stark contrast to the intense loyalty described in other moments of the narrative. This absence is not a minor footnote. It is a shadow stretching across the entire trial. You drift back into the dimly lit alleyways of Festival Jerusalem, imagining where those followers might have gone. Fear can scatter even the most committed hearts. Earlier reflections painted the city as a place humming with tension, where crowds could shift mood unexpectedly, and where authorities watched closely for signs of unrest. You picture the disciples hearing of the arrest, the suddenness of it, the late hour, the uncertainty. The silence around them becomes understandable. Unsettling, but understandable. Their disappearance from the accounts creates a gap that scholars still discuss. Did they flee, hide, or simply find themselves powerless in a process already unfolding too rapidly to influence? A more obscure detail creeps into your thoughts when you consider the legal environment. Followers of a potentially seditious figure might themselves be scrutinized by authorities. Offering public defense could risk association with the charges being framed. In a setting where Rome interpreted loyalty through the lens of political threat, stepping forward could have drawn the same suspicion. This detail, while seldom emphasized in popular retellings, subtly underscores the danger of proximity. To defend him could be to share his fate. Your mind shifts to another silence, that of many temple leaders who do not appear in the trial narratives. The sources mention certain elders, chief priests, and legal scribes, yet the broader council, wealthy families, landowners, and moderate voices remains absent or unnamed. Their silence raises one scholarly debate that continues to ripple across discussions. Was the gathering that deliberated Jesus' fate a full representation of the council or a smaller group acting under pressure? The lack of clear description invites speculation. Some argue that not all leaders agreed with the proceedings. Others suggest that a subset of powerful figures moved quickly, aware that a larger assembly might complicate or slow the process. The silence of those not mentioned leaves an ambiguous void, one that could conceal disagreement, neutrality, or simple absence due to the late hour. The sources do not clarify. Silence holds its ground like an unopened door. You drift again toward Pilate, whose voice resounds clearly in the sources, yet whose internal deliberations remain largely hidden. The accounts describe his actions, his gestures, his probing questions, but his private thoughts, those moments of calculation, shaped by ambition, career, fear, and memories of previous missteps, remain unspoken. You recall earlier reflections on Pilate's administrative style shaped by a blend of harshness and insecurity. Now you sense how the silence of his inner reasoning shapes the ambiguity of his involvement. Did he believe the accusations? Did he view the trial as routine? Did he resent being pulled into a religious dispute? His silence leaves space for interpretation, shaping the contours of debate even today. Another silence deepens the atmosphere. The absence of Roman documentation detailing the trial. Rome, meticulous in its record-keeping for matters of taxation, property, and military logistics, left nothing preserved about this specific proceeding. Scholars debate whether records were lost, never kept, or deemed too minor to preserve. Yet this absence itself is telling. To Rome, the execution may have seemed like a small precautionary act, not an event requiring official chronicle. The silence reveals the stark contrast between the trial's political insignificance to the empire and its profound significance to the communities who preserved the narrative. Silence becomes a reflection of perspective. You return to the earlier scenes with the crowd recalling how chants rose and shifted. Now you notice that the sources rarely offer detailed accounts of individual voices within that crowd. They describe collective reaction, but not personal testimony. This anonymity contributes to the impression that public opinion was shaped by mood rather than coherent argument. It also emphasizes how the voices of ordinary people remain absent from the historical record. Their motivations, fears, or misunderstandings go unspoken. Silence becomes both limitation and possibility. Perhaps some shouted because they believed the accusations. Perhaps others shouted simply because noise pulled them along. Perhaps many said nothing at all. A subtle, easily overlooked detail also emerges. Jesus himself remains quiet in many critical moments. He offers brief responses, metaphorical statements, or silence. That silence has long fascinated readers and scholars alike. Was it strategic, spiritual, resigned, defiant? His silence created interpretive space that others filled with accusations, assumptions, and fears. Earlier reflections highlighted how ambiguity invited misinterpretation. Now that ambiguity becomes embodied in silence. For Pilate, it may have been exasperating. For temple authorities, it may have offered an opportunity. For followers, it may have been confusing. Silence can be many things at once. A gentle joke floats into your thoughts, light as a feather in a world without microphones, perhaps. Jesus simply thought, anything I say will be misquoted anyway. You let the humor drift softly, mindful of the tenderness in the moment. You shift again to another notable absence, the voice of Rome's military. The soldiers who guarded the city, monitored crowds, and stood ready to intervene appear only at the margins of the story. They do not testify. They do not explain their perceptions. Their silence keeps you wondering how much influence their quiet presence exerted on Pilate's judgment. You remember how earlier chapters described the fortress overlooking the temple. From that vantage point, they observed everything. Their silence does not diminish their role. It amplifies the unspoken pressure they represented. And then perhaps the most haunting silence of all, the absence of any recorded protest from the broader community who once celebrated Jesus' arrival. Did they not know what was happening? Did the authorities move too swiftly for news to spread Were they intimidated by the presence of soldiers? The sources do not tell you. Silence curls around the narrative like mist, shaping your understanding through what is missing as much as through what is present. As you stand in this quiet circle of unspoken voices, disciples who fled leaders, who stayed silent, soldiers who watched crowds, who shifted an empire that did not record, and a defendant who answered sparingly, you begin to feel how silence itself became part of the machinery of the trial. It did not merely accompany the events, it shaped them. Silence created gaps that fear filled. Silence allowed accusations to go unchallenged. Silence provided space for leaders to interpret ambiguity according to their own urgency. And so the story moves forward, guided not only by testimony, but by the weight of words left unsaid. You return now to the rooms where decisions hardened into outcomes, where the faces behind the accusations begin to come into focus. Not villains from a simplified retelling, but individuals shaped by lineage, political pressure, economic interest, and the ever-present knowledge that Rome's tolerance could evaporate without warning. The machinery of the trial did not run on anonymous authority. It moved through the choices of specific people, each acting within a system that rewarded caution and punished hesitation. You begin with a well-established historical fact. The high priestly family, especially the house of Annas and Caiaphas, wielded enormous influence in Jerusalem during this period. Their authority derived not only from religious tradition, but from Roman appointment and approval. That dual dependence made their role deeply political. You picture Caiaphas first, the high priest at the time, a figure whose name appears consistently across sources. He held the office for an unusually long tenure, nearly 2 decades, a sign that Rome found him cooperative, reliable, and capable of maintaining stability. Longevity in that role did not result from spiritual devotion alone. It required political savvy negotiation and a keen sense of emerging threats. You recall earlier reflections on the temple's economic role and realize how Caiaphas would have felt responsible for protecting both religious order and the administrative structures that allowed the temple to function. Jesus' symbolic disruption, combined with rising public enthusiasm, would have signaled danger to someone whose position depended on keeping Rome satisfied. Stability was his mandate. Instability, even hinted, was unacceptable. Nearby in your imagination stands Annas Caiaphas's father-in-law, a former high priest, whose influence continued long after he left formal office. Ancient sources describe his family as one of the most powerful priestly dynasties of the era. Annas appears briefly, but pointedly, in several narratives surrounding the trial, suggesting he played a behind-the-scenes role in assessing Jesus' threat level. He represents one of those obscure details that, once noticed, subtly reshapes the scene, a figure no longer holding official power, yet still shaping outcomes from the shadows. His presence highlights how influence in Jerusalem was not strictly tied to titles. It flowed through networks of family prestige, wealth, and imperial favor. You let your attention drift to the elders and scribes, less prominent by name, yet crucial in forming consensus. They were legal experts, landowners, scholars, and administrators. Their interest in the case would not have stemmed solely from religious offense. As members of the elite, they bore responsibility for maintaining civility, ritual consistency, and political calm. Earlier reflections on the nighttime proceedings hinted at urgency overriding procedure. Now you see how these individuals accustomed to deliberation found themselves swept into decisions shaped by time pressure and fear of unrest. Their participation helped legitimize the process, even if the irregularities unsettled them privately. A gentle debate begins to unfold in your thoughts. Did all members of the leadership agree on the necessity of intervening, or were some hesitant, swept forward by stronger voices? Scholars remain divided. Some argue for a broad consensus rooted in shared fear of instability. Others propose that only a subset of leaders actively pushed the case forward, using their influence to persuade or pressure the rest. The absence of detailed internal records keeps this question open, but the silence noticed in earlier reflections suggests that not all voices were fully represented in the surviving narratives. The trial becomes not the will of a unified body, but the action of those with enough urgency and authority to steer the process. You now shift your focus to another category of prosecutors, rarely given attention: the officers of the Temple Guard. These were not Roman soldiers, but local security forces responsible for maintaining order in sacred precincts. Their loyalty lay with the priestly establishment, and their presence during the arrest reveals something subtle. If they were deployed, it meant the leadership perceived the situation as one requiring coordinated action rather than spontaneous intervention. Their role underscores how the temple authorities had their own enforcement mechanisms, allowing them to act quickly within familiar terrain. You imagine them moving deliberately through moonlit paths, guided not by malice, but by duty and instruction. Another figure enters softly: the unnamed accusers, whose testimonies appear in the accounts often contradictory or inconsistent. Their presence illustrates a common feature of ancient trials, where witnesses could be influenced by authority, expectation, or rumor. Their inconsistencies create a puzzle for modern readers, but likely reflected the rushed environment. You remember earlier reflections about irregularities in the proceedings, and now you see how hurried testimony contributed to the sense of urgency shaping the outcome. These individuals, whether sincerely concerned or encouraged by leaders, became instruments of a process already moving toward a predetermined goal. Your thoughts wander next toward Pilate, who, though not a prosecutor in the religious sense, became a prosecutorial figure in the political dimension of the trial. He represented Rome's authority, and once he accepted the framing of the charges, he became the final arbiter of state judgment. He did not need to believe the accusations fully. He needed only to believe that inaction posed more risk than action. Earlier reflections highlighted his administrative pressures and history of heavy-handed decisions. Now you can imagine how he viewed the situation through the lens of imperial duty, crowd control, and personal reputation. In that sense, he became a collaborator in prosecution, shaped by different motives, but aligned with the temple leaders' priorities. A soft, almost amused thought drifts in: if the trial were a modern workplace meeting, you might say it was run by individuals who all felt the boss is watching. So let's avoid errors at all costs. You let the gentle humor settle quietly, knowing the stakes here were far more serious. You also consider the broader community of elites, wealthy merchants, landowners, and those dependent on the temple's stability. Their voices are not recorded, yet their interests likely influenced the leadership's calculations. Prosperity and peace were closely linked. Any figure who disrupted the temple's rhythms risked disrupting the economy surrounding it. These individuals may not have spoken directly, but their existence exerted quiet pressure. Leaders acted not only for themselves, but for the stability of a system that supported thousands. Finally, you reflect on the prosecutor's underlying motivations woven through earlier chapters: fear of unrest, fear of Rome, fear of losing authority, fear of crowds shifting unpredictably. These fears did not stem from imagination alone. They were grounded in history. Judea had seen uprisings, crackdowns, and brutal reprisals. Leaders knew the cost of mismanaging tension. And so when confronted with a charismatic teacher, challenging norms and inspiring crowds, the prosecutors acted not through personal vendetta, but through perceived necessity. You let these profiles linger in your mind, recognizing that the trial's outcome emerged not from a single decision, but from the convergence of many, each shaped by personal pressure, institutional expectation, and political danger. The prosecutors were not faceless antagonists. They were individuals navigating complexity, responsibility, and fear. Their choices, layered and rational within their own context, moved the process toward its irreversible end. You drift now into a contemplative space where competing interpretations hover like lanterns suspended in mist. Each one glows with its own logic, yet none stands untouched by the political shadows cast across the unfolding events. The temptation, of course, is to search for a single, clean explanation for why Jesus was executed. But history, especially in a land as tense and layered as first-century Judea, rarely offers clean lines. And so you begin with one solid historical fact. Various Jewish groups of the period disagreed sharply on matters of purity, authority, and the proper interpretation of the law. Their debates were vigorous, emotional, and sometimes confrontational, but they did not typically result in executions. Disputes over theology alone rarely escalated to state-sanctioned death. Something additional had to be in play. You let that foundation settle as you examine alternative theories offered through time. The first pathway you consider is the purely religious explanation that Jesus was killed because he challenged established interpretations of the law or disrupted traditional authority. Certainly some of his teachings touched sensitive nerves, speaking of inner purity rather than ritual precision, offering forgiveness that bypassed established structures, describing a kingdom not linked to the temple, but to transformation. These ideas could unsettle leaders whose identity rested on maintaining ritual order. Yet as you compare this theory to earlier reflections on the temple confrontation, the crowds, the political atmosphere, you begin to sense its limitations. Religious disagreement, however passionate, usually resulted in debate or exclusion, not execution by Rome. Still, you linger with it, gently noticing how certain details lend it weight. The symbolic act inside the temple carried echoes of prophetic critique, the kind that earlier generations had leveled against corrupt leadership. Such critiques could feel like direct challenges to authority. Yet even here you feel the tension between religious offense and political danger. Religious disagreement alone does not explain why the charge presented to Pilate emphasized kingship rather than blasphemy. Something in the situation required translation into political terms. A second alternative explanation floats into view that intra-Jewish rivalry, especially among different sects, like Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and other groups, played a decisive role. These communities often held fiercely different visions for how the people of Israel should live under occupation. In this scenario, Jesus emerges as another competing voice in a crowded field of teachers and reformers. Perhaps his popularity threatened the influence of other factions. Perhaps his message cut across traditional boundaries, leaving none of the established groups fully comfortable. This interpretation feels plausible, especially when you remember how earlier chapters described the ambiguity of his language and the broad range of people drawn to him. Yet as you test this explanation against the broader pattern, a gap appears. Intra-Jewish disputes rarely involved Roman prefects. Internal disagreements could cause tension, yes, but they typically remained within the realm of debate and interpretation. For Rome to involve itself, the situation needed to rise to a political threshold, one connected to public order, not theological distinction. And so while rivalry may have contributed to unease among leaders, it does not fully explain the escalation to crucifixion, a punishment reserved for crimes against the state. A third theory whispers from the edges that the execution must be understood through theological necessity, a narrative developed by early followers who interpreted Jesus' death as fulfilling divine purpose. This explanation belongs more to faith than history, yet it shaped how the story was told and retold. It reframed events into cosmic significance, highlighting destiny rather than politics. But when you test this theory against the historical landscape painted in earlier reflections, crowds, soldiers, scribes, prefects, its limits become evident. It does not explain political behavior. It interprets the outcome. It offers meaning, not motive. For an investigation seeking historical clarity, this explanation becomes an overlay rather than a cause. A fourth viewpoint emerges quieter but compelling: that Jesus' radical inclusivity, his willingness to welcome outsiders, challenge purity boundaries, and reshape social hierarchies, was threatening not because of theology, but because of the social implications it carried. You recall earlier descriptions of how his actions toward marginalized people disrupted expectations. In a stratified society, gestures that erode hierarchy can feel subversive. Leaders guarding systems of privilege may have feared not only his teachings, but the crowd movements they inspired. This explanation adds texture, yet it still does not pierce to the center of why Rome specifically needed to become involved. Social reform could cause tension, but crucifixion required political concern. You pause and let all these explanations swirl around you like colored threads. Each holds truth. Each falls short. What unites them is their inability to account fully for the Roman response. Earlier chapters made it clear that Rome intervened when it perceived risk to stability. That is why the alternative explanations must be tested not in isolation, but against the broader context of occupation festival crowds and political fragility. A small, almost amusing thought drifts in: if ancient Judea had a suggestion box, each group would have slipped in a note complaining about Jesus for completely different reasons. One might say he challenged the law. Another, he stirred the crowds. Another, still, he disrupted revenue flows. You smile softly at the absurdity of a bureaucratic solution to a multi-layered crisis. But beneath the humor lies insight. Jesus was a figure who intersected multiple concerns simultaneously. No single explanation captures the complexity. As you revisit each theory, the pattern becomes clearer. Religious disagreement created tension, but not political urgency. Intra-Jewish rivalry contributed background friction, but not decisive escalation. Social concerns shaped unease, but did not compel intervention. Theological interpretation explained meaning, but not cause. It was only when these elements intertwined with the political anxieties of the time crowd, behavior, symbolic gestures, ambiguous claims, and the temple disturbance, that they acquired the force capable of triggering Roman action. And so the alternative explanations, when tested against the historical environment, begin to fold back into the central thesis: political fear acted as the accelerant. Not because Jesus wielded weapons or organized revolt, but because his actions, symbols, and followers created an atmosphere fragile enough for authorities to imagine the possibility of upheaval. You rest here, letting the threads return quietly to the loom. What remains is not the dismissal of alternative explanations, but their integration. Each contributed a strand of tension, yet only when seen through the lens of political danger did those strands bind tightly enough to shape the final outcome. You drift now into the rhythm of the calendar itself, feeling the pulse of ancient timekeeping, as though the passing of days were an actor in the story, quiet, subtle, yet undeniably influential. In first-century Judea, dates were not mere notations. They carried emotional weight, historical memory, and political electricity. And so you begin with a firmly grounded historical fact. Passover was the single most volatile week of the year in Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of pilgrims streamed into the city, to commemorate liberation from foreign rule, all while living under the shadow of yet another empire. The tension between celebration and occupation made this week uniquely sensitive. Every leader, Roman and Jewish alike, understood that timing was everything. You step into the crowded city once more, recalling earlier scenes filled with Palm Sunday excitement and swelling crowds. Now you feel the timing pressing inward, shaping how every gesture, rumor, and symbol might be interpreted. Passover was not simply a religious festival. It was a memory of deliverance recited in prayers and embedded in family stories. You imagine Rome watching this annual ritual with wary fascination. A festival celebrating liberation held under empire in a city famous for rebellious sentiment. What could possibly go wrong? A soft smile touches your thoughts. Your light joke landing gently if Rome had a festival risk rating system. Passover would have been labeled extreme supervision advised. You move through narrow streets where pilgrims gather, each carrying expectations colored by history. The calendar itself becomes a catalyst, sharpening fears on all sides. You recall earlier reflections about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, how crowds welcomed him with gestures echoing victory and deliverance. Now you see those images through the lens of Passover timing. If similar actions had occurred during a quieter season, authorities might have dismissed them. But during Passover, symbolism could ignite imagination. The same gestures that felt devotional in Galilee could feel revolutionary in a city packed with pilgrims remembering freedom from Egypt. An obscure detail surfaces when you consider Rome's administrative routines. Historical records indicate that prefects increased military presence in Jerusalem, specifically during major festivals. Troops circulated near the temple, positioned along routes of expected processions, and stayed prepared for rapid intervention. This heightened security created an atmosphere thick with caution. Every official, Roman or Jewish, knew their decisions carried more consequence during these days. Earlier reflections revealed how even symbolic actions inside the temple could be seen as destabilizing. Now you understand why the timing amplified anxiety. A disruption during Passover risked triggering memories of revolt. Even faint disturbances could escalate if interpreted through the prism of festival meaning. A long-standing scholarly debate enters your mind. Did Jesus intentionally choose Passover week to enter Jerusalem knowing its symbolic power? Or did events simply converge upon this moment? Some scholars argue his timing was deliberate, meant to communicate theological message about liberation and renewal. Others suggest his arrival was practical, coinciding with pilgrim travel. The debate remains unresolved, but what becomes clear is how the timing shaped perception. Whether intentional or not, his presence during the festival made his actions more visible and his symbolism more charged. You picture temple authorities feeling the mounting pressure. Their fear was not simply of theological challenge, it was fear of chaos erupting during the week when Rome's patience wore thin. Earlier reflections showed how the temple aristocracy relied on Roman favor. A disturbance under their watch, especially one linked to a charismatic teacher drawing crowds, risked embarrassment or removal. They understood that timing converted manageable concerns into urgent threats. A quiet critique in winter might be tolerated. A public confrontation in Passover could be catastrophic. Your thoughts return to the night of Jesus' arrest, visualizing shadows lengthening while officers move quickly. The timing of the arrest, late discreet, was not accidental. Leaders likely hoped to complete the process before morning, when crowds awoke and gathered in the streets. You recall earlier reflections about procedural irregularities. Now you see how these irregularities mirror the pressure of the calendar. Speed mattered. Delay carried danger. A dawn trial, a swift transfer to Pilate. a rapid verdict all shaped by the need to preempt unrest before the city fully stirred. Another subtle detail comes from the Roman perspective. Passover often coincided with increased political vigilance. Past rebellions clustered near festival seasons. Josephus recounts uprisings sparked by prophetic figures, each drawing crowds with promises or symbolic acts. To Pilate, these precedents would have shaped how he interpreted reports about Jesus. Timing fed suspicion. Even if Jesus spoke of spiritual renewal rather than revolution, the prefect would have evaluated him through the lens of previous festival agitators. The calendar becomes a filter, transforming ambiguous behavior into potential sedition. You pause to sense how earlier chapters, crowds, symbols, messianic language converge under the weight of timing. The same teachings that stirred hope, the same gestures that challenged the temple's rhythms, the same public enthusiasm that followed him, now appeared magnified. The timing did not create meaning, but it increased the stakes of every meaning perceived. A gentle joke floats in Soft and Sleepy. If Jerusalem had weather forecasts like modern cities, it might have announced. This week's outlook: high spirits, scattered pilgrims, and a strong chance of political anxiety. And yet beneath the humor lies a sharper truth. Leaders lived braced for this week, knowing that the wrong moment of excitement could ignite something unstoppable. You continue examining how timing shaped interpretation. Consider his symbolic action inside the temple courts. Performing such a gesture in an ordinary month might have drawn curiosity or irritation. But during Passover, when national identity shimmered at the surface of every interaction, the act could appear prophetic or inflammatory. The calendar heightened sensitivity. Messages that would be seen as metaphor in calmer seasons could appear as political statements when spoken in festival, charged with historical meaning. An often overlooked detail emerges as you think of the pilgrims themselves. Many came from rural areas oppressed by heavy taxation and economic strain. Passover for them was not only spiritual renewal, but an emotional release. Gathered together in great numbers, sharing stories of hardship and hope, they could form a potent, unpredictable mass. Authorities feared such crowds not because they were violent, but because they were emotionally primed. A single spark, symbolic or rhetorical, could shift the mood dramatically. This explains why both temple leaders and Pilate viewed timing as part of the threat. Your thoughts drift to Jesus at supper with his closest followers, surrounded by the ritual language of liberation. Even without political intention, these symbols echoed themes that shaped community identity. The timing infused every gesture with deeper resonance. Leaders observing from a distance could not separate these rituals from their political implications. The calendar blurs boundaries. Spiritual moments become politically charged simply because of when they occur. As you let all these impressions settle, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Timing was not incidental to the trial, it was central. Passover magnified crowd enthusiasm, heightened Roman suspicion, accelerated temple anxiety, and compressed legal processes into a narrow window where caution outweighed deliberation. The week itself acted like a lens focusing fears into sharp necessity. Leaders did not only ask, "Who is this man?" They also asked, "Why now of all weeks?" And in that question, timing became justification. You walk now into the harsher edges of imperial rule, where peace is maintained not through harmony, but through carefully rationed fear. The Pax Romana, despite its poetic name, did not rest on mutual goodwill. It rested on deterrence, on the visible reminder that Rome had both the will and the means to suppress unrest long before it could spread. And so you begin this part of the journey anchored in a clear historical fact: crucifixion was a punishment used almost exclusively by Rome for political offenders, rebels, slaves, and anyone perceived as destabilizing public order. It was not simply execution, it was public messaging written in wood nails and suffering. Its purpose was to frighten witnesses into compliance. This knowledge quietly reshapes your understanding of the trial. You recall earlier reflections on timing the volatility of Passover and the swirling fears among both temple authorities and Roman officials. Now you see how the final act, the crucifixion itself, functioned within a larger system of intimidation. Rome did not execute merely to punish. Rome executed to remind. Even a single death could broadcast the empire's stance with chilling clarity. The message traveled faster than soldiers' uprising will be crushed, challengers will be displayed, obedience is wise. An obscure detail emerges when you consider the geographical placement of crucifixions. They were often carried out along major roads leading into or out of cities, ensuring maximum visibility for pilgrims and traders. The intended effect was psychological: let every traveler see what happens to those who threaten the state. The choice of location near Jerusalem, a city packed with visitors, was no coincidence. In a week celebrating liberation, Rome asserted dominance. The timing amplified the spectacle. What earlier reflections described as political anxiety now manifests in public demonstration. As you picture this, your thoughts return to the temple authorities. They too understood the power of intimidation, though their methods were gentler by comparison. Maintaining order meant discouraging movements that could embarrass or provoke Rome. Their decision to involve Pilate was not simply about neutralizing a threat. It also served to demonstrate their commitment to stability. Allowing Rome to carry out the execution distanced them from direct responsibility while benefiting from an unmistakable warning to the public. Do not follow a leader who disrupts sacred and political systems. You recall earlier descriptions of their concern that Jesus' actions might inspire the crowds. Now you see how the crucifixion reversed that dynamic, shifting influence away from Jesus and back toward established authorities. A long-standing scholarly debate floats up. Did the temple leaders pursue execution primarily to restore internal authority, or did they act to satisfy Rome's expectations? Some argue they feared losing influence if Jesus continued challenging ritual norms. Others contend they acted to preempt Roman crackdown. The truth may lie in the overlap. Violence as deterrence served both parties. It reinforced Rome's dominance while reassuring the temple aristocracy that their governance remained intact. You drift toward Pilate once again, sensing the cold logic behind his decision. Earlier reflections traced his tendency to act decisively when he perceived risk. Here his motives sharpen. A crucifixion during Passover sends a firm message to pilgrims: this is not the week for uprisings or prophetic movements. Whatever sympathy or hesitation he may have felt disappears in the face of political necessity. Violence, when used strategically, becomes a preventative measure. In Pilate's mind, one death could prevent many. A soft, wry thought flickers in the ancient equivalent of a public service announcement, except delivered with horrifying clarity. The empire never whispered. It displayed. You let the humor drift gently, knowing its softness contrasts sharply with the reality beneath it. You turn now to the psychological dimension of intimidation. Crucifixion was designed to be slow, drawing out suffering in full view of onlookers. The spectacle served not only Rome's authority, but also its narrative. By labeling someone a political criminal, however thin, the evidence, the execution reframed the individual from teacher to threat. Earlier reflections explored how charges were shaped and reframed. Now you see how the method of punishment finalized that narrative. A crucified figure becomes, in the eyes of passers-by, someone deemed dangerous enough to receive the empire's harshest sentence. The punishment thus reinforces the accusation, even if the accusation was ambiguous. An obscure but revealing detail appears: Rome often crucified individuals along with inscriptions naming their alleged crimes. This practice ensured that the message of deterrence was unmistakable. In Jesus' case, the inscription reportedly referenced kingship, an unmistakably political label. This inscription did not reflect his intentions. It reflected Rome's framing. You recall earlier reflections on the ambiguity of his teachings. Now the ambiguity dissolves into imperial simplicity, King of the Jews, a title used not to honor, but to condemn. You let your mind wander into the reactions of the watching crowd. Earlier public opinion played a fluid and easily influenced role in the trial. Now their silence during the crucifixion becomes part of the psychological atmosphere. Fear has its own gravity. People watching would have absorbed the message quickly. If Rome executes a man connected to hope healing and symbolic protest, then no one is safe from suspicion. The spectacle chills potential imitators. Leaders who once wondered whether followers might mobilize now see deterrence taking root. Another layer now unfolds: the effect on his closest followers. Their earlier silence, explored in the previous chapter, now deepens into trauma. A public execution serves not only to intimidate crowds, but to disorient a movement. Crucifixion could fracture identity, erode confidence, and scatter communities. The loss of their teacher in such a humiliating manner sent a message not just about political danger, but about the futility of resistance. You sense how Rome's method aimed not merely to punish an individual, but to dissolve the collective energy surrounding him. And yet beneath this forceful deterrence, an unexpected paradox lingers. Violence, which Rome intended to silence, sometimes amplifies a message instead. Scholars across centuries have noted that the execution of Jesus, intended to extinguish potential unrest, ultimately fueled a movement that would reach far beyond Judea. This paradox becomes your third soft joke whispered gently. Rome tried to end a conversation only to create history's longest-running discussion. You linger a moment longer with the broader theme. Violence, intimidation, and deterrence formed an ecosystem of control in first-century Judea. The trial's outcome emerges not simply from theological disagreement or internal politics, but from a system designed to maintain order through fear. Leaders acted within that system, shaped by its expectations, constrained by its consequences, and influenced by its methods. And so the execution becomes not merely the end of a life, but the performance of empire, an attempt to prevent not only rebellion, but imagination. You stand now in the uneasy quiet that settles after spectacle, a hush that feels almost unnatural in a city swollen with pilgrims. The cross has been lifted down, the crowds have dispersed, and Jerusalem returns to its layered rhythms, yet not without subtle shifts in atmosphere, authority, and perception. The immediate aftermath of the execution reveals much about why it happened in the first place, because the consequences align with the political goals of those who orchestrated it. And so you begin with a grounded historical fact. Rome's primary objective in Judea was the preservation of public order, especially during volatile festivals. By that standard alone, the swift removal of a potentially influential figure represented a success in Roman terms. You drift through the city, imagining how different groups processed the event. Start with the temple authorities, whose whispered meetings and urgent decisions earlier now give way to cautious relief. The disturbance inside the temple courts is resolved. The festival continues. No violent outbreak occurs. Passover concludes without major incident. For leaders already navigating a tightrope between maintaining ritual authority and satisfying Roman expectations, the quiet that follows the crucifixion must have felt like vindication. Their decisions, however irregular or rushed, had prevented a greater crisis. You recall earlier reflections describing their fear of unrest and Roman intervention. Now that fear begins to recede, their immediate objective, stability, has been secured. One obscure detail surfaces: the temple authorities likely expected the matter to fade quickly. Jesus, after all, was executed alongside other political offenders. In Roman practice, such deaths were not memorialized. Bodies of crucified individuals were often left as deterrent symbols or disposed of without ceremony. Though burial circumstances surrounding Jesus have long been debated, the norm for Rome was clear: erase the memory of the condemned through indignity. From the temple leader's perspective, this outcome would have served a dual purpose: the disruption would vanish, and the moment of danger would dissolve into routine festival closure. They would return to ordinary governance, interpreting law, maintaining ritual, and balancing political relationships. Their power structure remained intact. You now shift your attention to Pilate. For him, the aftermath likely felt even simpler. A potentially destabilizing figure was removed. The crowd did not riot. The festival proceeded. Rome's visual demonstration of authority had been executed without logistical complications. For an administrator evaluated on his ability to suppress unrest, the quiet morning after the crucifixion represented a successful operation. Earlier reflections painted Pilate as both harsh and insecure, aware of his precarious standing with Rome. Now you imagine him writing a brief report, if he wrote one at all, summarizing the event as a preventative action taken to preserve order during a sensitive period. The execution would not have been exceptional. For Pilate, it was one more calculated decision in a portfolio of decisions meant to keep the province manageable. Another layer of political effect becomes visible when you consider the larger system of deterrence. The public crucifixion communicated clearly to Judeans and pilgrims alike that Rome's watchfulness was acute during festivals. The message likely reached rural villages as people returned home: do not gather around charismatic teachers who stir crowds. Do not misread symbolic gestures as political invitations. Rome's patience has limits. This psychological reinforcement would have reassured Roman officials and temple leaders that the rest of the season could proceed without upsetting the fragile equilibrium described in earlier chapters. In a world where rumors spread quickly, one execution could shape sentiment far beyond its immediate audience. A scholarly debate whispers into the moment: did Rome or the temple authorities expect Jesus' movement to dissolve immediately after his death? Most likely, yes. Many prophetic or messianic figures of the period gained followers temporarily, but faded once eliminated. Rome assumed quelling a leader quelled the movement. The temple leadership likely believed the same. The absence of disciples in court, explored earlier, may have reinforced this impression. Without public defense or protest, the movement appeared small, disorganized, or easily dissuaded. Authorities may have concluded that followers would disperse in fear, their hopes evaporating after witnessing the brutality of Roman punishment. You let your thoughts drift toward those followers, now imagining their fragmented conversations in hidden rooms. Grief mixes with terror. The shock is palpable. Their teacher's arrest was sudden, his execution even more so. In the immediate aftermath, they face a political landscape reshaped by fear. Earlier reflections described silence as a powerful force. Now that silence deepens, they are not prepared to challenge the decision. They are simply trying to understand what happened. Politically, this moment registers as a collapse of momentum, just as Rome and the temple authorities intended. Another obscure detail enters movements built around charismatic leaders often suffered immediate disintegration when those leaders were removed. Without formal structure governance or clear succession, such groups rarely survived the shock of violent suppression. Scholars note that many would-be prophets of the period left no lasting trace after being executed. This historical pattern suggests why authorities may have acted decisively. Eliminating the figure would prevent the formation of a lasting movement. The crucifixion was not only punishment, it was strategy. As you explore the city's mood, you sense an odd blend of forgetfulness and unease. To many pilgrims, the execution might have seemed like just another display of Roman power, a grim reminder, but not an extraordinary event. Political offenders were crucified regularly enough that the sight, while sobering, was not unusual. Passover continued. Sacrifices resumed. Families completed their rituals. The festival rhythm restored itself. Within the broader empire, the event likely registered barely at all. No imperial correspondence recorded it. No Senate discussion noted it. Silence swallowed it, reinforcing earlier reflections about the absence of Roman documentation. Yet even in this silence, you detect subtle shifts. The temple authorities likely recognized their partnership with Rome had been publicly displayed. Their credibility with Rome was solidified. Their internal authority reaffirmed. But these gains came at a cost. Any decision aligning too closely with Roman interest risked undermining public trust. Though the broader community remained quiet, now seeds of unease may have been planted. Some may have wondered whether the leaders acted out of necessity or expedience. Some may have questioned whether religious and political authority had grown too intertwined. But these questions for now stayed unspoken. Another political effect emerges when you consider Pilate's reputation. Whatever reluctance or calculation he displayed during the trial, the outcome reinforced his willingness to act decisively. The crucifixion reaffirmed the prefect's power. In later years, according to sources like Philo, Pilate faced criticism for his brutality. The decision to execute Jesus may have aligned with this pattern, contributing to a reputation that eventually led to his dismissal. But in the immediate moment, Rome would have viewed the trial as competent administration. And so you step back from the scene, noticing how the aftermath reflects the priorities of those in power. Stability restored. No riot. No uprising. Festival concluded. The political system fragile, though it was held together another day. You allow one soft, sleepy joke to float in if Rome had kept scorecards. Pilate might have scribbled Passover 1 disturbance neutralized, no major incidents, performance satisfactory. The humor lands, gently dissolving into the quiet. You linger a moment longer in this stillness, understanding that the aftermath reveals the logic behind the trial. It was never merely about belief or doctrine. It was about the swift reassertion of order in a landscape where timing crowds and symbols threatened equilibrium. Yet even as authorities rested, believing the matter resolved, something else, small, persistent, began to form in the spaces they overlooked. You drift now into the most delicate layer of the story, not the events themselves, but the memories of those events shaped and reshaped as communities tried to understand what had happened and why. If the aftermath in Jerusalem seemed quiet on the surface, the real transformation began later within gatherings of followers who wrestled with grief, confusion, and hope. Their retellings eventually formed the narratives now known as the Gospels, but these writings were not diary entries. They were interpretations crafted decades after the trial, shaped by communities that needed meaning, coherence, and comfort. And so you begin with a firm historical fact. The earliest written Gospel Mark was composed around 40 years after the crucifixion, long after Rome destroyed the temple in 70 CE. Memory by then was already filtered through new fears, new hopes, and new political realities. You imagine those communities scattered across the empire, some in small homes in Rome, others in synagogues in Syria, still others in mixed gatherings in Asia Minor. They were people negotiating identity in a world where Rome remained powerful and unpredictable, where Jewish communities were strained by internal divisions, and where followers of Jesus were trying to explain how their hoped-for leader met such a humiliating death. Earlier reflections revealed how Rome designed crucifixion as deterrence, a spectacle meant to erase movements. Yet here, the opposite happened. Memory refused to die, but memory to survive had to adapt. An obscure detail rises to the surface as you consider Mark's composition. Scholars note that Mark's narrative places significant responsibility on the temple leadership while portraying Pilate as hesitant. This framing, while reflecting certain traditions, also reflects the political needs of early Christian communities living under Roman rule. Criticizing Rome too directly would have been dangerous. Portraying Rome as reluctant made the movement appear less threatening. You see how memory begins shaping itself around survival. The harshness of imperial power softens in the narrative not because Pilate was gentle, but because communities needed to navigate life under empire without painting themselves as enemies of the state. You sense how earlier reflections on silence now echo through this process. The silence of the disciples during the trial becomes reinterpreted as confusion or fear. The silence of Jesus becomes dignity, prophecy, or fulfillment. The silence of Rome's official records allows early communities to construct meaning without contradiction. Memory begins filling gaps with theology, emotion, and storytelling. Not fabrication, but interpretation, human minds trying to reconcile trauma with faith. A long-standing scholarly debate arrives softly. Were the Gospels written primarily as historical recollections or as theological portraits shaped by community needs? Most scholars suggest a blend of both. They contain memories rooted in eyewitness tradition, yet they also reshape those memories to express meaning. For example, the emphasis on Jesus' innocence in the Gospels parallels the political need to distance the movement from charges of sedition. At a time when Rome was sensitive to unrest, especially after the Jewish revolt, the early Christian communities could not afford to appear rebellious. Reframing the trial as a miscarriage of justice rather than a political threat served both devotional and practical purposes. You imagine Matthew's community composed largely of Jewish followers of Jesus navigating tensions with the synagogue after the destruction of the temple. Their gospel intensifies conflict with certain Jewish authorities, not as historical hostility, but as a reflection of the community's own experience. Memory adapts again, shaped not by events in Pilate's courtyard, but by later debates about identity. Earlier reflections highlighted how temple leaders feared unrest and Roman reprisal. Now in memory, those leaders absorb more blame while Rome recedes into administrative background. The rewriting becomes less about what happened and more about how communities interpreted power, betrayal, and loss. Luke's narrative introduces further shaping. Writing to communities that included Gentile followers, Luke emphasizes Jesus' innocence, repeatedly portraying Pilate as recognizing it multiple times. This repetition seems almost formulaic, and scholars often cite it as evidence of rhetorical strategy. If the movement hoped to flourish within the empire, framing Roman authority as capable of recognizing truth, yet pressured by circumstances, allowed followers to coexist with the state. Memory then becomes diplomacy. A careful negotiation between reverence for Jesus and the necessity of living under imperial rule. A gentle joke emerges as a whisper: if each gospel is a different camera angle, then the editors were not just adjusting lighting, they were very politely moving the Roman governor slightly off-screen. You let the humor soften into the quiet, aware that the observation, though light, carries weight. John's Gospel, composed even later, takes yet another approach. It expands the theological meaning of the trial, portraying Jesus as fully aware, fully in command of his destiny, almost orchestrating the moment. The political tension fades into cosmic drama. By the time John writes, the memory of the historical trial dissolves into a narrative of divine purpose. It is not that the history is erased. It is simply woven into a larger tapestry, where earthly politics becomes the stage for spiritual revelation. Another obscure detail glints at the edge of your thoughts. Early Christian writers lived in a world where Roman suspicion of new religious movements increased over time. To survive, communities emphasized moral citizenship, loyalty to Rome, and the innocence of their leader. This context helps explain why the Gospels portray Pilate with more ambiguity than other historical sources do. Memory reshapes itself to protect vulnerable communities. Memory becomes strategy again. You drift back to the earlier reflections on how charges were framed for Pilate kingship influence crowd behavior. Now you watch those charges reframed again, in the narrative softened into misunderstandings or misinterpretations. The political motives behind the execution recede into theological necessity or prophetic fulfillment. Memory transforms fear into meaning. Trauma becomes liturgy. What authorities intended as deterrence becomes the foundation of a movement that would endure far beyond Jerusalem's walls. Yet this reshaping is not deception. It is the natural work of communities trying to understand themselves. When people remember traumatic events, they focus not only on what happened, but on why it matters. Memory chooses significance. The trial becomes not only the story of a political execution, but the story of innocence, condemned hope, misunderstood, and a leader whose death requires interpretation to make sense of his life. A final gentle joke lands like a feather. Historical memory is a bit like families explaining why a disastrous holiday dinner wasn't anyone's fault. Everyone tells the story slightly differently, but the meaning grows deeper over time. You let the smile fade softly. As you step back, the shaping of memory begins to illuminate something essential. The political dynamics that led to the execution remained clear to authorities, but the meaning of the event transformed entirely within the communities who remembered it. Their retellings, layered with theology, emotion, diplomacy, and hope, preserved the story not as Rome intended, but as they needed. In that reshaping, the trial moved from a tool of intimidation to the narrative heart of a growing movement. You move now into a broader landscape, letting your perspective drift beyond Jerusalem's walls to the wider world of Roman governance, where political executions formed a familiar rhythm of control. This shift outward helps you understand the trial not as an isolated anomaly, but as part of a recognizable pattern. And so you begin this reflection with a solid historical fact. Rome frequently executed charismatic figures who attracted followers, stirred public imagination, or appeared capable of mobilizing unrest. These individuals did not need to organize armies or issue manifestos. Influence alone, especially influence expressed through symbol prophecy or public gatherings, could trigger decisive suppression. You picture for a moment other movements that flickered across Judea in the decades surrounding Jesus' life. Historians like Josephus describe several figures whose actions or reputations unnerved authorities. Theudas, for example, persuaded crowds to follow him to the Jordan River, promising miraculous signs. Rome's response was swift and brutal, dissolving the movement before it could grow. Another figure, sometimes called the Egyptian prophet, gathered a significant following near the Mount of Olives, speaking in ways authorities interpreted as potential rebellion. The result, too, was violent suppression. These cases form a pattern: charismatic teachers drawing crowds during politically sensitive times triggered Roman alarm, not because their teachings threatened doctrine, but because their influence threatened order. An obscure detail emerges when you examine what Romans feared most in these cases. It was not doctrinal innovation or moral teaching. It was mass movement. Crowds were the unpredictable element capable of shifting emotional tone faster than soldiers could respond. Earlier chapters traced how Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, his symbolic gestures, and the ambiguity of his message created a similar potential. Now you see how Rome would have interpreted him through the same lens it applied to other figures. A leader who attracted a crowd was a leader who might inspire hope, and hope, especially during festivals commemorating liberation, was dangerous. You let your imagination drift to other provinces. The Roman world was filled with small revolutionary flare-ups, prophetic voices, and uprisings fueled by local grievances. In each case, Rome responded with overwhelming force to prevent contagion. The empire's logic was simple: stamp out the spark before it becomes a flame. This approach did not discriminate between violent rebels and symbolic leaders. If a figure reminded Rome of unrest even faintly, the punishment was swift. You recall earlier reflections about Pilate's administrative pressures and reputation for harshness. Now you see how his decision followed a common Roman strategy. He was not inventing a response. He was applying a familiar template. A long-standing scholarly debate enters quietly: should Jesus be compared more closely to prophets like Jeremiah and Amos, who critiqued power symbolically, or to would-be revolutionaries suppressed by Rome? Scholars disagree because Jesus' teachings did not call for violence, yet his symbolism, especially at Passover, especially in the temple, carried political resonance. The comparison thus reveals the intersection of ambiguity and authority. Jesus did not resemble a rebel in intent, but he resembled one in effect. His influence, timing, and symbolism created the pattern Rome associated with agitators. Earlier reflections described this ambiguity as volatile. Now you see how ambiguity in Roman terms could be treated no differently from overt threat. You drift momentarily to Athens, where Socrates was executed centuries earlier, not by Rome, but by a democratic court worried about subversive influence on young minds. Although the context differs, a similar dynamic appears: officials fearing the persuasive power of a charismatic teacher interpret philosophy as destabilization. The comparison is imperfect, yet illuminating. Both executions reveal how societies under strain often target individuals whose ideas threaten established frameworks. Influence becomes danger, ambiguity becomes threat, and public punishment becomes reassurance. A soft, gentle joke rises in your mind: if ancient authorities had guest lists for most likely to disturb the peace, charismatic teachers would have topped them, probably with a little star next to their names. You let the humor drift, aware that its lightness helps soften the edges of a difficult truth. Another case flickers into view: John the Baptist, executed by Herod Antipas. His death reveals yet another version of the pattern. John attracted crowds. He critiqued rulers publicly. His influence extended beyond religious teaching into moral authority. Even though Herod hesitated, fearing the people, he ultimately acted under pressure. The dynamics echo earlier chapters: leaders balancing public fear, personal anxiety, and political survival. John's execution did not involve Rome, but it mirrored the logic Rome applied. Leaders remove those who might inspire unrest before unrest emerges. You return now to Rome's crucifixions along major roads, the inscriptions labeling the condemned, the spectacle designed to warn. These scenes resemble the executions of other prophetic or populist figures, not only in Judea, but across the empire. Spartacus and his followers were crucified by the thousands along the Appian Way to warn slaves and soldiers alike. Although Jesus' followers were peaceful and his teachings nonviolent, Rome's method did not distinguish categories of influence. If a figure carried symbolic authority that might mobilize people, Rome responded with visual dominance. An obscure but intriguing detail comes from Egypt, where prophetic figures sometimes claimed divine power or interpretive insight. Rome viewed them with suspicion, similar to its suspicion of Judean prophets. Some were eliminated quietly, others publicly. Although their messages differed from Jesus's in content, the mechanism of suppression remained consistent. Rome responded to influence, not ideology. As these comparative cases gather around you, a pattern crystallizes. Jesus was not executed because he fit the mold of a revolutionary. He was executed because he fit the mold of individuals Rome considered potentially revolutionary. His movement, peaceful though it was, resembled the early stages of movements Rome had seen turn dangerous elsewhere. His timing Passover mirrored previous uprisings. His symbolism kingship liberation temple disruption echoed themes associated with political agitation. His crowds amplified everything. A second soft joke arises weary and warm. Rome may not have understood theology, but it understood crowds as well as any modern stadium security team. You let the humor pass gently into silence. One last comparison settles into view the executions Rome carried out to prevent unrest, even when guilt was uncertain. Roman administrators often justified these actions with a simple principle: better to suppress one figure than risk a rebellion. This principle shaped Pilate's logic. It shaped the temple leaders' fears. It shaped the outcome. The comparative lens clarifies what earlier chapters have slowly revealed: the execution of Jesus was part of a broader imperial pattern. A pattern of preemptive violence, symbolic deterrence, and the suppression of influence that might, under the right or wrong conditions, blossom into political upheaval. And so his trial becomes not an outlier, but a familiar story dressed in unique symbolism. You stand now at the edge of the investigation, surrounded by the fragments you have gathered. Political tension, religious ambiguity, crowd, volatility, irregular procedures, strategic collaborations, and the quiet force of Rome's deterrent machinery. Each fragment glows faintly, like pottery pieces arranged on a table. The task before you is not to fuse them into a perfect reconstruction that is impossible with ancient evidence, but to observe how their shapes fit together. And so you begin with a grounded historical fact: Rome crucified Jesus. No matter how the details vary across accounts, the ultimate decision was imperial, not purely religious. Crucifixion was not a punishment for blasphemy. It was a punishment for political threat. You take that fact and hold it gently as a compass. If Rome carried out the execution, then Rome perceived significance in the situation. The challenge is to determine whether that significance reflected genuine danger or only the perception of danger amplified by timing symbolism and the anxieties of the moment. Earlier reflections revealed how Jesus' entry into Jerusalem occurred during the most politically charged festival of the year. It involved imagery branches, acclamation procession that echoed liberation themes. His symbolic disruption inside the temple courts resonated with prophetic critique, but also tapped into fears of unrest. His teachings, layered with metaphor, created multiple interpretations. Some disciples might have heard spiritual renewal. Some bystanders might have heard political hope. Authorities trained to anticipate disturbance heard risk. You step back and consider the temple leaders. Their power depended on maintaining calm, not simply because Rome demanded it, but because their own authority was intertwined with the delicate balance between autonomy and imperial oversight. Earlier chapters traced how the economic and administrative functions of the temple created a system highly sensitive to symbolic acts. Jesus' gesture turning over tables, interrupting commerce, challenging purity structures, was not merely religious critique. It threatened an entire framework that kept the temple leadership legitimate. Fear of disorder, fear of Rome's scrutiny, and fear of internal erosion formed a triad shaping their decisions. Under that pressure, even minor disturbances could appear catastrophic. In their eyes, removing Jesus preemptively preserved stability. You drift now to Pilate, whose role has hovered over every previous chapter, like an opaque figure behind glass. The puzzle with Pilate is not whether he acted politically, it is how he interpreted what he saw. Earlier reflections described his administrative style harsh when provoked, cautious when cornered, decisive when threatened. His job was not to parse theology, but to prevent anything resembling sedition. Reports of crowds gathering of ambiguous claims that could be read as kingship of temple disruption and of mounting public attention would have triggered his instinct for early suppression. For Pilate, uncertainty itself was dangerous. Ambiguity invited precaution. Even if Jesus offered no explicit political challenge, the appearance of public influence was enough. Rome's logic rarely required evidence. It required probability. You examine the legal irregularities, the nighttime proceedings, contradictory testimonies, abrupt shifts in charges. These anomalies, earlier noted, do not necessarily point to conspiracy. They point to urgency. Leaders acted quickly because they feared delay. The irregularities reveal a system under stress, bending under political pressure. They show that the issue was not theological clarity. It was the need to deliver Jesus to Pilate, with charges Rome could act upon. Blasphemy would not suffice. Political agitation, however loosely defined, would. Now you return to the role of the crowd. Public opinion, previously described as fluid and easily influenced, became a crucial stage for both the temple leadership and Pilate. The crowd outside the praetorium served as a barometer of potential unrest. Its mood, shaped by suggestion, fear, fatigue, or simple curiosity, gave Pilate justification. Leaders could point to public sentiment, whether spontaneous or cultivated, as evidence that the situation required decisive action. You recall how earlier chapters emphasized that both authorities preferred to deflect responsibility. A crowd calling for execution provided cover. You then consider the comparative cases explored earlier. Other prophetic or charismatic figures met similar fates when Rome sensed even a faint echo of rebellion. Theudas, the Egyptian prophet. Countless unnamed agitators. Jesus was not the only figure to attract followers in ways that alarmed authorities. These parallels reveal a pattern. Rome was willing to eliminate leaders whose influence might destabilize the province. Such executions served as warnings. Jesus' crucifixion fits into this established imperial practice. You pause here, letting all these elements settle around you. This is where the forensic synthesis takes shape, not in certainty but in convergence. One piece alone does not prove political motive. But when all are placed together, a pattern emerges. Passover timing heightened tension. Public acclaim amplified perception. Symbolic temple action triggered institutional fear. Ambiguous language allowed multiple interpretations. Temple elites sought to preserve stability. Pilate sought to prevent unrest. Roman policy favored preemptive suppression. The method of execution signaled political crime. One gentle joke drifts in, soft enough not to break the mood. If ancient Judea had a risk assessment committee, Jesus' file might have been stamped potentially troublesome. Monitor closely. You let the humor settle quietly, recognizing that behind it lies the truth of how bureaucracies transform ambiguity into action. You then consider whether a purely religious motive could stand alone. Religious dispute played a role, certainly. Jesus challenged interpretations, practices, and structures. But religious disagreement rarely leads to crucifixion, and the charges presented to Pilate were not religious, they were political. Even the inscription placed above the cross referred not to theology but to kingship. Once Rome entered the process, the path followed imperial logic, not doctrinal debate. An open question lingers, a scholarly debate difficult to resolve. Did Jesus intend political significance, or did political meaning attach itself to him through misunderstanding and context? The evidence remains ambiguous. But from the perspective of authorities, intention mattered less than perception. Influence, timing, symbols, and crowds created an image they could not ignore. You step back again to examine the whole picture. What do these converging elements reveal? That the trial was not the result of a single motive, but of overlapping fears. The temple authorities feared disruption and loss of control. Pilate feared unrest and imperial reprimand. The crowd feared consequences of being on the wrong side of authority. Each group interpreted Jesus through its own anxieties. And at the center stood a teacher whose message was open to layers of interpretation, spiritual, to some political, to others threatening to those who guarded order. The synthesis leads you gently to a conclusion without yet stating it outright. The evidence overwhelmingly aligns with a political reading of the execution shaped by perception, precaution, and the machinery of power. You let this understanding rest for a moment, softening into silence, knowing the final conclusion waits just ahead. You arrive now at the moment where the separate strands you've followed, the fears, the symbols, the timing, the crowds, the irregularities, settle into a single, steady view. Not a perfect certainty, because history rarely offers that, but a conclusion supported by the weight of converging evidence. And you begin with the clearest historical anchor available. Rome executed Jesus by crucifixion, a punishment specifically reserved for political offenders. Whatever else surrounded his life or message, the empire interpreted his presence as a political threat, or at least as a political risk great enough to require removal. From that foundation, the pathway becomes clearer. You look first to the temple leaders whose actions throughout the sequence reflect not theological indignation alone, but political calculation. Earlier reflections described how the temple leadership existed in a fragile balance between autonomy and Roman oversight. They needed to preserve ritual authority, economic order, and public calm, not just to carry out their duties, but to protect their position within Rome's administrative structure. Jesus' disruption in the temple during Passover threatened that equilibrium. His action was symbolic, yes, but symbols are rarely neutral in a city primed with expectation. It challenged not only religious practice, but also the perception of stability the temple aristocracy had to maintain. This made him, from their perspective, a liability at the worst possible time. You step next to the crowds. Their enthusiasm during his entry, their whispering expectations, their gathering in public spaces, each contributed to a sense of momentum that could easily be interpreted as unrest waiting to unfold. Earlier reflections emphasized how crowds during Passover were especially volatile. Even a peaceful gathering could appear threatening to Rome if it expressed hope in alternative authority. Jesus' popularity, amplified by festival context, became part of a pattern Roman officials recognized from previous uprisings. His actions may not have intended revolt, but intention mattered less than appearance. This brings you to Pilate, who stood at the end of the decision chain. Throughout earlier chapters, a portrait emerged of a prefect shaped by caution, reputation, and a history of missteps. He had reason to act decisively rather than risk further trouble. Reports of a popular teacher symbolically challenging temple commerce drawing crowds and speaking in ways that could be interpreted as royal claims, even metaphorically, would have activated his instinct for preemptive suppression. Pilate did not need certainty. He needed only to sense that doing nothing posed more risk than taking action. When the temple authorities presented Jesus framed in political terms, Pilate recognized the familiar shape of potential disturbance, and Rome's method of handling disturbances was consistent across the empire. The trial's irregularities now make sense within this framework. Earlier observations revealed how testimony was rushed, processes compressed, charges reframed. These irregularities reflect urgency, not coincidence. Leaders needed to move before crowds awakened or rumors spread. They needed to deliver Jesus to Pilate with charges he could act on. And Pilate, feeling the tension of the festival rising around him, would have wanted the matter resolved before it spiraled. Legal norms bent under the pressure of political necessity. The machinery of authority sought not truth, but stability. As you step back, you see how earlier alternative theories, religious offense, intra-Jewish rivalry, theological fulfillment, fit into the larger picture. Each contributed texture, but none fully explained the Roman involvement. Once Rome stepped in, the frame shifted entirely to political interpretation. The temple leaders may have begun from religious concern, but they leveraged political language to secure Roman cooperation. Rome may have had no interest in doctrinal debate, but it acted swiftly when public excitement and symbolic gestures pointed toward potential rebellion. The execution thus became the product of overlapping motives, all converging toward the same outcome. A gentle, soft-edged observation floats into your thoughts, almost a joke, though it carries a weary wisdom. In an anxious political system, being misunderstood can be just as dangerous as being guilty. Jesus was not misunderstood in one simple way. He was misunderstood in several by multiple groups, each projecting their own fears and expectations onto him. Temple leaders saw instability. Pilate saw unrest. Crowds saw possibility. And in the tangle of those projections, his fate was sealed. When you consider the broader pattern of Roman responses to charismatic figures, the conclusion strengthens. Jesus fit the model Rome used to identify potential threats, influence timing, symbolic action, and ambiguous authority. Not because he advocated violence, but because he could inadvertently inspire it. Rome acted not on certainty, but on probability. The crucifixion worked as a preventative measure, a deterrent, a public reassurance that order would be maintained. And so when all the strands converge, the theory with the strongest historical support is this: Jesus was executed primarily as a political precaution, a preemptive removal carried out by Roman authority, shaped and accelerated by temple leaders who feared the consequences of inaction during a volatile festival. Not a political revolutionary in intent, but treated as one because his influence intersected with the anxieties of those who governed. You let that conclusion rest gently in the air, neither triumphant nor tragic, simply clear. All the evidence leans toward the same direction. His death functioned as a political execution driven by perception, shaped by fear, enacted through collaboration, and sealed by a punishment reserved for threats to the state. And now, with the core mystery resolved as fully as the historical record, allows you move softly toward the final chapter, where the questions that linger do so not in the realm of politics, but in the quiet spaces of reflection, meaning, and memory. You step gently into the final movement of this long journey, letting the urgency of earlier chapters fade into something softer, slower, almost fragile. The trial is over. The verdict has been carried out. The political mechanisms have done their work. Yet what lingers is not only the harshness of the execution, but the quiet questions left drifting in its wake, questions that do not demand answers so much as invite contemplation. The first consequence is stark. The authorities believed the crisis was over. Pilate resumed his festival vigilance, confident he had acted decisively enough to deter unrest. The temple leaders returned to the rhythm of sacrifice and governance, reassured that stability had been preserved. Crowds dispersed, carrying home fragments of rumor and memory. At the political level, the execution achieved exactly what it was intended to achieve. Order returned, tension dissolved. No uprising followed. But beneath that surface, something subtler stirred. A small, shaken circle of followers began trying to make sense of what had happened. Earlier chapters traced how silence surrounded them during the trial, but now silence becomes the soil where new interpretations slowly take root. They had expected a teacher, a healer, perhaps even a liberator. Yet the one they followed died the death of a rebel. What do you do with a story that ends where you never imagined it would? Their attempts to answer that question would eventually reshape how the world understood the trial, the man, the message, and the meaning. But in these early moments, all they had was grief, confusion, and a faint thread of hope they could not yet name. Another consequence emerges quietly: the political decision that ended one movement inadvertently gave birth to another. Rome and the temple leaders acted out of fear, fear of crowds, fear of unrest, fear of symbols that resonated too powerfully during festival week. Yet fear can miscalculate. The execution, meant to extinguish influence instead, hardened it into narrative, into teaching, into communal memory that deepened rather than dissolved. This paradox doesn't erase the historical motive. It simply reveals how history often moves in directions its actors never anticipate. And now, as the night settles around you, the quiet questions drift forward, soft as candlelight. What might have happened if the festival had not been approaching? If the city had not been swollen with pilgrims? If symbolic acts had been interpreted through gentler lenses? If ambiguity had been met with curiosity instead of caution? What might have happened if Pilate had felt more secure in his role? If Rome had been less suspicious of prophets and crowds? If the temple authorities had not lived under the shadow of imperial scrutiny? These questions cannot be answered, not because the evidence is missing, but because they belong to the realm of possibility, not history. They are reflections, not conclusions. They remind you gently that political systems often act not on truth, but on fear. That leaders sometimes suppress threats that exist more in imagination than in reality, and that consequences unfold in ways no one intends. You breathe slowly now, letting the narrative settle into a quieter register. The storm of symbols and accusations fades. The clamor of crowds dissolves. The flicker of torches in the courtyards dims into the memory of stone. What remains is the image of a man caught between the machinery of empire and the anxieties of those charged with preserving order. His death, shaped by politics rather than simple belief, leaves behind a trail of meaning that others would someday gather, interpret, and carry into new worlds. And as the lights of ancient Jerusalem soften in your imagination, you allow the final thoughts to stretch into long, calming lines. You're no longer investigating, no longer sifting evidence, just drifting slowly through the quiet aftermath of a story that has echoed far beyond its moment. The trial fades. The city settles. History exhales. And in the hush that follows, the unanswered questions rest gently where they belong, held but not forced.